Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Bankhead National Forest in northern Alabama, in a place locals call the Devil's Hollows. I still wake up screaming some nights, clawing at sheets that feel too much like the rough bark of those ancient pines. The doctors say it's PTSD, that my mind is trying to process trauma. They don't understand that some traumas aren't meant to be processed, they're meant to be warnings. It started as a simple team-building retreat. Our company, Dataflow Solutions, had been hemorrhaging employees after a brutal quarter, and our manager Janet thought a weekend camping trip would boost morale. "Nothing brings people together like surviving in the wilderness," she'd said with that forced corporate smile. If only she'd known how prophetic those words would become. The group consisted of 5 of us. Myself, Janet Reed, our department manager, Thomas Davis, the office pessimist who complained about everything, Sarah Rodriguez, the new hire who was still trying to prove herself, and Kevin King, the office jokester who treated everything like a game. We were all office drones, soft from years of desk work and air conditioning. None of us had any real wilderness experience, but Janet had booked us a primitive camping experience through some outdoor adventure company. The drive to Bankhead took 3 hours through increasingly desolate country roads. Fall had painted the Alabama hills in brilliant oranges and deep crimsons. But as we descended into the forest, the colors seemed to drain away, leaving only the dark greens of pine and the gray of dying leaves. Our destination was a remote camping area called Bee Branch, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through miles of uninhabited forest. "Christ, this place gives me the creeps," Thomas muttered as we unloaded our gear. The trees pressed in on all sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at noon, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The air smelled wrong, not the clean pine scent you'd expect, but something organic and rotting, like meat left too long in the sun. "Oh, come on, it's beautiful," Sarah said, but her voice carried a forced enthusiasm that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as us. She kept glancing around nervously, jumping at every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of a branch. Kevin was already setting up his tent, whistling some annoying pop song to fill the oppressive silence. "This is going to be awesome. Just us, nature, and no internet to distract us from quality bonding time." He waggled his eyebrows at Sarah, who rolled her eyes. Janet consulted her printed itinerary with military precision. "All right, team, we'll set up camp, gather firewood, and then participate in trust-building exercises. Tomorrow, we'll do orienteering and survival skills." She paused, looking around at the encroaching forest. "The guide company said there are some old trails in this area, but we should stick to the marked paths. That should have been our first warning. When locals tell you to stick to marked paths, there's usually a damn good reason." We spent the afternoon setting up camp in a small clearing beside Bee Branch Creek. The water ran black and sluggish, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. Occasionally, something would ripple beneath the surface, too large to be a fish, too purposeful to be debris. I found myself staring at those ripples, trying to make sense of shapes that seemed almost human. "Mike, you're creeping me out with that staring," Kevin said, snapping me back to reality. "Help me with this firewood before it gets dark." The forest floor was carpeted with deadfall, but every piece of wood we touched crumbled to pulp or felt unnaturally cold, as if it had been frozen despite the mild October weather. The trees themselves seemed wrong, twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark scarred with what looked like claw marks. Some of the marks were fresh, the wood still weeping sap. "What do you think made these?" Sarah asked, running her finger along a gouge that was easily 4 inches wide and deep enough to sink her finger to the knuckle. "Probably just bears," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I'd seen bear sign before during my brief Boy Scout years. These marks were too deliberate, too purposeful. They formed patterns, symbols almost, that hurt to look at directly. As darkness fell, we gathered around our meager fire. The wood we'd finally managed to collect burned fitfully, producing more smoke than heat and casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. The fire kept changing colors too. Sometimes a normal orange, other times an unsettling green or blue that made our faces look corpse-like. "So," Janet said, consulting her clipboard, "let's start with an icebreaker. Everyone share something the group doesn't know about you." Kevin went first, regaling us with the story of how he'd accidentally set his college dorm room on fire making ramen. Sarah talked about her secret passion for horror novels, which seemed ironically appropriate given our surroundings. Thomas complained about his ex-wife's alimony payments. Janet shared her dream of climbing Mount Everest. When it was my turn, I found myself talking about my younger brother Danny, who'd died in a car accident 3 years ago. I don't know why I brought it up. It wasn't something I usually shared, especially not with coworkers. But something about the oppressive darkness and the unstable fire made me feel like I needed to confess, to get the words out before something stopped me. He was only 22, I heard myself saying. Just graduated college, whole life ahead of him. I was supposed to pick him up from a party that night, but I was tired, told him to get an Uber instead. The words felt like glass in my throat. If I'd just gotten off my lazy ass and driven 20 minutes... The silence that followed was broken by a sound from the forest. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It started soft, almost like wind through the trees, but gradually rose in pitch and volume until it became unmistakably vocal. Human, but wrong, like someone screaming through a throat full of broken glass. We all froze, staring into the impenetrable darkness beyond our small circle of firelight. The sound continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt solid. "What the hell was that?" Thomas whispered. "Probably just an owl," Janet said, but her voice shook. "Or maybe a mountain lion. They can sound very human-like." Kevin forced a laugh. "Great, mountain lions. That's exactly what I wanted to hear before trying to sleep in a tent." But I knew it wasn't a mountain lion. I'd heard that sound before, in the weeks following Danny's funeral. Late at night, when guilt and grief kept me awake, I'd sometimes hear that same wailing coming from somewhere deep inside my own chest. It was the sound of loss-given voice, of grief made manifest. We tried to continue our team-building exercises, but the mood was broken. Every few minutes, one of us would glance nervously at the tree line, and conversation became stilted and forced. The fire seemed to be struggling too, the flames guttering lower despite our constant feeding of wood. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah announced she was going to her tent. "Early to bed, early to rise, right?" she said with false cheer. But I noticed she kept her flashlight beam moving constantly as she walked the 20 feet to her tent, and she zipped the door with unusual speed. Thomas followed suit shortly after, grumbling about the cold and the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Kevin tried to keep the party going for a while, making increasingly desperate jokes, but eventually even he gave up. "Guess that leaves you and me to keep watch, Mike," Janet said as Kevin disappeared into his tent. "Watch for what?" She shrugged, but her eyes never left the darkness beyond the fire. "Whatever made that sound, I suppose?" We sat in uncomfortable silence for a while, feeding the dying fire and straining our ears for any unusual sounds. The forest had come alive with small noises, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the occasional splash from the creek. But underneath it all was something else, a rhythmic sound like breathing, or maybe footsteps circling our campsite just beyond the range of our vision. "Mike," Janet said suddenly, "do you see that?" I followed her gaze to a spot about 50 yards away where the trees were particularly thick. At first, I saw nothing but shadows, but then something moved. A pale shape flitting between the trunks, there one moment and gone the next. "Probably just a deer," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, the shape appeared again, and this time I got a better look. It was tall and thin, moving with an unnatural gait that was wrong somehow. Too fluid, too quick. And for just a moment, before it vanished again, I could have sworn I saw it looking directly at us. "I don't think that was a deer," Janet whispered. The shape appeared a third time, closer now, and with growing horror I realized it was moving toward our camp. Not walking, gliding, its feet barely seeming to touch the ground. In the unstable firelight, I caught glimpses of features that made my stomach lurch. Skin stretched too tight over prominent bones, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, and a smile that stretched too wide, revealing too many teeth. "We need to wake the others," I said, standing so quickly I knocked over my camp chair. But as I turned toward the tents, I froze. Kevin's tent was empty, the door hanging open and flapping in a breeze I couldn't feel. His sleeping bag lay unzipped, as if he'd been pulled out of it in a hurry, or as if he'd left from the inside. "Kevin?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Kevin, where are you?" Silence. Janet was on her feet now, too, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she swept it across the campsite. Maybe he just went to use the bathroom. But we both knew that wasn't right. Kevin was many things. Immature, obnoxious, overly familiar, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have wandered off into the dark forest alone, especially not after that sound we'd heard. "Kevin!" I shouted, abandoning any pretense of calm. My voice echoed strangely in the trees, seeming to bounce back from multiple directions. "Kevin!" A rustling sound came from Thomas's tent, and his voice emerged, groggy and irritated. "What the hell is all the yelling about? Some of us are trying to sleep." "Kevin's missing," Janet called back. "His tent is empty." Thomas's tent unzipped with urgent speed, and he emerged wearing only boxers and a t-shirt, his flashlight already in hand. "What do you mean, missing?" We explained about the pale shape in the woods and Kevin's empty tent. Thomas's irritation quickly transformed into concern as he processed the information. "We should check Sarah's tent," he said. The three of us approached her tent together, and I felt my heart sink when I saw that her door was also open, the interior dark and empty. Her sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, just like Kevin's. "This is not happening," Janet muttered, running her hands through her hair. "People don't just vanish." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. We all felt it, the wrongness of this place, the sense that normal rules didn't apply here. "We need to call for help," Thomas said, pulling out his phone. The screen lit up, showing no signal bars. "Shit, no service." I checked my own phone with the same result. Janet's was completely dead, the screen black and unresponsive despite having been fully charged that afternoon. "The car," I said. "We can drive out, get help, come back with search and rescue." But when we made our way to where we'd parked, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, we found only empty space. The Toyota Camry that had brought us here was gone, leaving no tracks, no sign it had ever existed. "This is impossible," Thomas said, his voice rising toward panic. "Cars don't just disappear." "Obviously someone took it," Janet said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe Kevin and Sarah went for help?" We all knew that was wishful thinking. Even if our coworkers had decided to leave for some reason, they wouldn't have taken the car without telling us, and they certainly wouldn't have left their personal belongings behind. Backpacks, clothes, even Sarah's purse were still in their tents. A new sound came from the forest then. Laughter. High and wild, with an edge of hysteria that made my skin crawl. It was coming from multiple directions, as if we were surrounded by invisible comedians sharing some enormous joke. "That's Kevin," Janet said with desperate hope. "Kevin, is that you? This isn't funny anymore." The laughter continued, but now I could hear other voices mixed in. Sarah's giggle but pitched wrong, too high and too sharp. The sounds circled our campsite, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. "Come back to camp," I shouted. "Whatever game you're playing, it's over." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by that same keening wail we'd heard earlier. But now it was clearly human voices making the sound. Kevin and Sarah's voices, but distorted and wrong, as if they were screaming through broken vocal cords. "We're leaving," Thomas said suddenly. "Right now. We'll walk out." "Walk out?" Janet turned to stare at him. "It's 20 miles to the nearest road and we don't even know which direction." "I don't care. I'm not staying here another minute." He started toward his tent to gather his things, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait. Let's think this through. If we stay together, keep the fire going, we can make it until morning. Then we'll have light to see by. We can figure out where we are." "And what if Kevin and Sarah need help right now?" Janet asked. Before I could answer, Kevin's voice came from the darkness, calling my name. "Mike? Mike, I'm hurt. I need help." The voice was coming from the direction of the creek, maybe 50 yards away. It sounded like Kevin, but something was off. The cadence was wrong. The tone too flat. "I'm coming," I called back, starting toward the sound. Janet grabbed my other arm. "Don't. Something's not right." "Kevin," I called out, "are you okay? What happened?" "I fell," the voice replied, still with that strange flat effect. "I think my leg is broken. I can't move." Thomas shined his flashlight toward the creek, but the beam seemed to die after only a few feet, swallowed by the unnatural darkness. "I don't see anything." "Please," Kevin's voice came again, but now it seemed to be coming from a different direction, behind us, near where we'd found the car missing. "It hurts so bad. Please help me." "That's not Kevin," I said suddenly with absolute certainty. "Kevin hates the word hurt. He always says aches or sore, or makes some stupid joke about it. He'd never say, 'It hurts so bad.'" As if responding to my words, the voice changed, becoming deeper, more guttural. "Please help me, Mike. It hurts so bad. It hurts so bad." The last words came out as a roar that echoed through the forest, and I realized we were hearing what Kevin's voice might sound like if he were being torn apart while he screamed. "Jesus Christ," Thomas breathed. "What is that thing?" Sarah's voice joined in then, but like Kevin's it was wrong. Too high, too sweet, with an underlying rasp that suggested a damaged throat. "Michael, don't listen to Thomas. Come find us. We're having so much fun out here. So much fun. So much fun." The last phrase dissolved into that horrible laughter again, both voices joining in a harmony that made my teeth ache. We huddled together by the fire, backs to each other, flashlights pointing outward in all directions. The voices continued to call to us, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, always from just beyond our range of vision. They used our names, shared inside jokes from work, referenced conversations only our missing coworkers could have known about. "It's some kind of predator," I said, trying to make sense of the impossible. "It's mimicking their voices to lure us away from the fire." "Predators don't make cars disappear," Thomas replied, "and they don't make phones stop working." He was right, of course. Whatever was happening here went beyond any natural predator. But admitting that meant accepting that we were dealing with something supernatural, something that shouldn't exist. Hours passed. The voices continued their psychological assault, sometimes close, sometimes far, always wrong. They would call out our names, beg for help, describe gruesome injuries in clinical detail. Occasionally, we'd hear what sounded like Kevin and Sarah having conversations with each other, but the words were gibberish, as if someone was playing human speech backward. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. But when the first gray light began to filter through the trees, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't bringing the relief I'd hoped for. The forest looked even more wrong in daylight. The trees were too tall, their branches too twisted, and the ground was covered with what looked like bones. Hundreds of them, scattered among the dead leaves like discarded toys. "Those aren't human," Janet said when she noticed me staring. too small. Probably rabbits, squirrels. But as we moved closer to gather wood for our dying fire, I could see that she was wrong. Mixed in with the animal bones were others. Finger bones, rib bones, what looked like pieces of human skulls, all of them yellowed with age, some cracked and gnawed as if something had been feeding on them. "We need to leave," Thomas said. "Right now." This time, none of us argued. We quickly broke camp, stuffing our gear into backpacks and trying to determine which direction might lead back to civilization. The problem was that everything looked the same. Dense forest in all directions, with no clear trails or landmarks. "The creek," I said finally. "If we follow it downstream, it has to lead somewhere." We set off along the creek bank, walking single file with Janet in the lead, consulting a compass that spun wildly and seemed to point in different directions every time she looked at it. "This thing is broken," she muttered, giving it a shake. After what felt like hours of walking, we realized we were seeing the same landmarks over and over: a distinctive split-trunk oak, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a fallen log that formed a natural bridge over the creek. We were walking in circles, somehow returning to the same stretch of forest no matter which direction we traveled. "This is impossible," Thomas said, sitting down heavily on the bear-shaped boulder. "We've been walking straight downstream for 3 hours. We should be miles from where we started." That's when we heard the voices again, Kevin and Sarah, calling to us from the forest ahead. But this time, when I looked through the trees, I could see them. They were standing about 100 yards away, just visible through the gaps between the trees. From a distance, they looked normal. Kevin in his flannel shirt and hiking boots, Sarah in her pink jacket. They were waving at us, gesturing for us to come closer. "Kevin! Sarah!" Janet called out, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God! We've been looking for you all night." She started toward them, but I grabbed her arm. Something was wrong with the way they were standing. Too still, too straight, like mannequins posed by someone who'd never seen a human being move naturally. "Wait," I said, "look at their faces." Even at this distance, I could see that their expressions were wrong. They were smiling, but the smiles were too wide, stretching beyond the natural limits of human facial structure. And their eyes were completely black, like holes punched in their faces. "Kevin," I called out tentatively, "is that you?" The Kevin thing nodded enthusiastically, its neck bending at an angle that would have broken bones. When it opened its mouth to speak, the voice that came out was Kevin's, but underneath it was something else. A wet, clicking sound like insects moving through rotting meat. "Mike, come here. We found something amazing, something wonderful." The Sarah thing spoke too, its voice sweet and melodic and completely devoid of emotion. "You have to see this, Janet. It's everything we've been looking for, everything we've ever wanted." "What did you find?" Janet called back, though I could hear doubt creeping into her voice. Both figures pointed deeper into the forest, their arms moving in perfect synchronization. "Come and see," they said in unison. "Come and see what we found. Come and see what found us." "We're not going anywhere," Thomas said loudly. "You come here. Come back to camp." The things that looked like our co-workers tilted their heads at identical angles, and for a moment, their facades seemed to slip. I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. Pale, emaciated forms with 2 long limbs and faces that were barely human. Skin stretched tight over prominent bones. Mouths full of too many teeth, and those horrible black eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "We can't come back," the Kevin thing said, its voice taking on a sadder tone. "We're part of it now, part of the forest, part of the hunger." "But you can join us," the Sarah thing added. "It doesn't hurt. Not after the first few minutes." That's when they started walking toward us, and I realized their movements were all wrong. They weren't walking so much as gliding, their feet barely touching the ground. Their limbs moved too fluidly, bending in ways that human joints don't allow. "Run," I whispered. "What?" Janet turned to look at me. "Run!" We scattered, crashing through the underbrush in different directions. I heard Thomas screaming behind me, but when I looked back, he was gone. Janet was running parallel to me, about 20 yards to my left, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she stumbled over roots and rocks. The forest seemed to be actively working against us, branches reaching out to snag our clothes, roots rising up to trip us, and thorns tearing at our exposed skin. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, not the heavy footfalls of running humans, but something lighter and more fluid, like water flowing uphill. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, then ran some more. The landscape blurred past in a green and brown streak, punctuated by brief glimpses of things that shouldn't exist: trees with faces in their bark, animals with too many eyes, shadows that moved independently of their sources. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath against a massive pine tree, I realized I was alone. Janet was nowhere to be seen, and the forest around me was completely silent. Even the normal sounds, birds, insects, wind through leaves, had ceased entirely. That's when I saw it. About 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a cluster of boulders, was a structure. At first glance, it looked like a cabin, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something far older and far more wrong. The walls were made of bones, human bones, stacked and mortared together with what looked like dried mud and hair. The roof was thatched with scalps, still bearing patches of hair in various colors and lengths, and hanging from the eaves like wind chimes were dozens of hands, some still wearing wedding rings or watches. The smell hit me then, a cloying, sweet stench of decay that made my stomach heave. I pressed my hand over my mouth and nose, trying not to vomit when I heard a voice from inside the structure. Michael Williams. It was my brother's voice, Danny's voice, as clear and real as if he were standing next to me. "Michael, I've been waiting for you." I knew it wasn't really Danny, knew it was the same thing that had mimicked Kevin and Sarah, but hearing his voice again, even twisted by whatever malevolent intelligence was using it, sent a wave of longing through me so powerful that I actually took a step toward the bone cabin. "I know you've missed me, Mike. I know you blame yourself for what happened." Another step. The logical part of my mind was screaming warnings, but the emotional part, the part that had been drowning in guilt for 3 years, wanted desperately to believe. "It wasn't your fault," Danny's voice continued, "and you can join me now. We can be together again." I was almost to the door of the cabin when I saw the pile of clothes beside it. Flannel shirt, hiking boots, pink jacket. Kevin's and Sarah's clothes, torn and stained with dark patches that could only be blood. The spell broke. This wasn't Danny, and whatever had happened to my co-workers was going to happen to me if I didn't get away immediately. I turned to run, but the voice followed me. "Don't leave me again, Mike. Don't abandon me like you did that night." Each word was like a knife in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving. The forest was a maze of identical trees and repeating landmarks, but I pushed forward, following what I hoped was a consistent direction. That's when I found Thomas. He was hanging from a tree about 10 feet off the ground, suspended by what looked like spider webs but thicker and stickier. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth was moving silently. As I got closer, I could see that something was moving under his skin, ripples and bulges that suggested things crawling around inside his body. "Thomas!" I called out, looking for a way to get him down. His head turned toward me with a wet, tearing sound, and when he smiled, insects spilled from his mouth. Beetles and centipedes and things I didn't recognize, all gleaming black and moving with purpose. "Hey, Mike," he said, his voice thick and buzzing. "Having fun yet?" I ran. The forest closed in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, roots rising up to trip me at every step. I could hear things following me, not just footsteps, but skittering sounds like dozens of insects moving in formation, and that awful wet, sliding noise that suggested something large dragging itself across the ground. I don't know how long I ran or how far I traveled. Time seemed meaningless in that place, stretching and contracting like taffy. At some point, the sun set again, though I could have sworn it had just risen. The darkness was absolute, broken only by my failing flashlight beam. When I finally stopped, exhausted and disoriented, I found myself back at our original campsite. The fire was still burning, though I was certain we'd let it die when we left that morning. Our tents were set up exactly as they'd been, and there was fresh coffee brewing on a camp stove I didn't remember packing. Janet was sitting by the fire, warming her hands. She looked up as I stumbled into the clearing. "Michael, thank God you're okay. I've been so worried." She looked normal. No black eyes, no unnatural smile, no insects crawling under her skin. Just Janet, tired and dirty from our ordeal in the forest. "Janet, is it really you?" She laughed, though it sounded strained. "Of course it's me. Who else would it be?" I approached cautiously, studying her face for any sign of the wrongness I'd seen in the others. She seemed genuine, but then again, so had Kevin and Sarah at first. "What happened to the others?" I asked. Her expression grew sad. "I don't know. I've been calling for them, but there's no answer. I think something took them." We sat by the fire in silence for a while, both of us jumping at every sound from the forest. The flames danced normally now, casting ordinary shadows that behaved exactly as shadows should. "We need to get out of here," I said finally. "I know, but which way? Every direction looks the same." She was right. In the firelight, the forest was an impenetrable wall of darkness. We could wander for days and never find our way out. "We'll wait for first light," I decided. "Then we'll pick a direction and stick to it, no matter what we see or hear." Janet nodded, then reached into her backpack and pulled out a thermos. "Coffee? I made it while I was waiting for you." The coffee smelled wonderful, rich and dark with just a hint of cinnamon the way I liked it. I accepted the cup gratefully, taking a large swallow before I realized that Janet couldn't possibly know how I liked my coffee. We'd never had coffee together outside of work, and at the office, I always drank it black. I looked up to confront her about this and froze. Janet was watching me with an expression of hungry anticipation, her eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's. As I watched, her smile grew wider and wider, stretching beyond the limits of human anatomy. "How do you like the coffee, Michael?" she asked, her voice taking on that same flat effect I'd heard from the Kevin thing. "I made it especially for you." The cup fell from my numb fingers as I realized what I'd done. The coffee had tasted wrong, bitter underneath the pleasant flavor, with a metallic aftertaste that was growing stronger by the second. "What did you give me?" I gasped. "Something to help you sleep," the Janet thing replied. "Something to help you dream. The dreams are the best part. You get to see everyone you've lost, everyone you've failed. Danny will be there, waiting for you." The world started to spin, and I felt my legs give out. As I collapsed beside the fire, the last thing I saw was the Janet thing's face peeling away like a mask, revealing something pale and hungry underneath. I woke up in darkness so complete it felt solid. The air was thick and humid, with that same sweet smell of decay I'd noticed at the bone cabin. I tried to move and realized I was suspended somehow, wrapped in something sticky that held my arms and legs immobile. Web. I was wrapped in spider web, just like Thomas had been. Panic gave me strength and I managed to tear one arm free. My fingers found my pocket and the small LED keychain light I'd forgotten I was carrying. The weak beam revealed that I was in some kind of cave or underground chamber, suspended about 6 feet off the floor. The walls were covered with more webs, and hanging in them were dozens of other forms. People wrapped in cocoons like flies in a spider's web. Some of the forms were still moving. I managed to free my other arm and began tearing at the webs around my legs. The material was incredibly strong, but not impossible to break with enough force. As I worked, I heard movement below me, a skittering sound like enormous insects moving across stone. My light beam swept across the floor and illuminated the source of the sound. It was the thing that had been pretending to be Janet, but now I could see its true form. It was roughly humanoid but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent in too many places. Its skin was pale and translucent, showing dark veins underneath, and its face was a horrible mixture of human and insect features. But it wasn't alone. There were others. The Kevin thing, the Sarah thing, and creatures I didn't recognize that might once have been other missing campers. They moved across the cave floor with that same fluid gait, their black eyes reflecting my light like mirrors. "Michael," the Janet thing called out, its voice echoing strangely in the cave. "You're awake? Good. We were worried the dose was too strong." "What are you?" I managed to ask as I continued working on the webs around my legs. "We are the hunger," it replied. "We are the need that grows in lonely places, in forgotten spaces. We are what remains when everything else has been consumed." One of my legs came free, then the other. I was still suspended by webs attached to my back, but I could move more freely now. "What did you do to my friends?" The creature gestured to the other cocoons with one too long arm. "They're here. They're part of us now. Soon, you will be too." That's when I heard it. Thomas's voice. Weak, but unmistakably real, coming from one of the nearby cocoons. "Mike! Mike, is that you?" I swung my light toward the sound and saw a familiar face peering out through torn webbing. Thomas was alive, though he looked terrible, pale and gaunt as if he'd been drained of blood. "Thomas, hold on. I'm coming." I managed to swing myself toward his cocoon, using my weight to stretch the webs holding me. The creatures below hissed and chittered, moving toward the cave wall to intercept me. "Too late," the Janet thing said. "The process has already begun. Can't you feel it, Michael? The hunger growing inside you?" And, horrible as it was, I could feel something, a gnawing emptiness in my stomach that had nothing to do with not eating. It was as if something was consuming me from the inside out, hollowing me out like a termite-infested log. I reached Thomas's cocoon and began tearing at the webbing with my free hand. He was weak but alive, and together we managed to free him from the worst of the entanglement. "The others," he gasped. "Kevin and Sarah, they're here somewhere." We swung from cocoon to cocoon, following the sounds of weak voices calling for help. Sarah was semi-conscious, delirious with fever. Kevin was in worse shape, his skin almost gray, but he was still breathing. The creatures below us were agitated now, climbing the cave walls with inhuman speed. We had maybe minutes before they reached us. "There." Thomas pointed to a section of the cave wall where I could see a faint glimmer of light. That might be a way out. It was going to require swinging from web to web, using the suspended cocoons as anchor points. One mistake and we'd fall into the waiting arms of those things below. "I'll go first," I said. "Test the route." "Mike," Thomas grabbed my arm. "If I don't make it, you'll make it. If I don't, tell my kids I loved them. Tell them their old man went down fighting." I nodded. Then began the terrifying journey across the cave. Each web strand groaned under my weight, threatening to snap and send me plummeting. Behind me, I could hear the creatures getting closer, their claws scraping against stone as they climbed. I reached the far wall and found what I'd hoped for, a narrow crevice that led upward, probably to the surface. It was barely wide enough for a human body, but it was our only chance. "Come on," I called back to the others. One by one, they followed my route across the cave. Sarah nearly fell twice, saved only by Kevin's quick reflexes despite his weakened condition. Thomas brought up the rear, moving with grim determination even as the creatures reached the level of the webs. The Janet thing was right behind him as he squeezed into the crevice. Its long arm reached out, claws scraping against his leg, but he kicked hard and broke free. The passage was a nightmare of sharp rocks and tight spaces. But it did lead upward. After what felt like hours of climbing and crawling, we finally emerged into the gray light of dawn, somewhere deep in the Bankhead National Forest. We were miles from where we'd started, in a part of the forest that looked more normal. The trees were the right shape, the ground was free of bones, and the air smelled like pine instead of death. "Which way?" Sarah asked weakly. I consulted my compass, which was finally working properly again. East. The road should be that way. We walked for most of the day, supporting each other when necessary, not speaking much about what we'd experienced. What could we say? Who would believe us? When we finally reached the main road, we flagged down a park ranger who took one look at our condition and immediately called for medical assistance. We were treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and various cuts and scrapes, but physically we were all going to be fine. The official report stated that we'd gotten lost in the woods and spent 3 days wandering before finding our way back to civilization. Our car was discovered parked at a different trailhead 15 miles away, with no explanation for how it had gotten there. Kevin, Sarah, and Thomas all moved away within 6 months. We don't keep in touch. I think we all realized that talking about what happened only made it more real, more vivid in our memories. Janet was never found. The search teams combed the forest for weeks but found no trace of her. Eventually, she was declared legally dead, the victim of an unfortunate accident in the wilderness. But I know better. I know she's still down there in that cave, or in whatever dimension those creatures inhabit. Not Janet, of course. The real Janet died that first night, but something wearing her face, using her memories, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to wander into the Devil's Hollows. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think I can hear her voice calling my name from somewhere far away. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear Danny's voice too, still asking me to come find him, to join him in that place where the hungry things wait. I've never been camping again. I tell people it's because I prefer hotels, creature comforts, room service. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. I know there are things in the wilderness that are always hungry, always waiting, always ready to wear the faces of the people we love to lure us into their web. And I know that somewhere in the remote hollows of the Bankhead National Forest, those things are still there, still waiting for the next group of city folk looking for a team-building retreat in the wilderness. God help whoever finds them first. My name is Michael Williams and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Sipsey Wilderness of Alabama's Bankhead National Forest 3 weeks ago. I'm telling this story from a hospital bed, my left arm in a cast, 17 stitches across my scalp, and burns covering 30% of my body. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive. They don't understand that luck had nothing to do with it. The trip was Ryan's idea. Ryan Mitchell, my college roommate, and the kind of guy who thought extreme camping meant bringing only 2 cases of beer instead of 3. He'd been going through a rough divorce and needed to reconnect with nature. His words, not mine. The group consisted of me, Ryan, our friend Jacob Carter from work, and Ryan's younger brother Dennis, who'd just turned 21 and was eager to prove himself on what he kept calling a real man's adventure. We planned 5 days in the Sipsey, specifically the remote southeastern section near the Alabama River tributary where few hikers ventured. The area was known for its limestone bluffs, hidden caves, and thick canopy that blocked out most sunlight even at midday. Ryan had found the spot on some obscure hiking forum, complete with GPS coordinates and warnings about the difficulty of the terrain. Perfect, he'd said. No cell service, no people, just us and the wilderness. The first sign something was wrong came before we even reached the trailhead. My Toyota 4Runner started making a grinding noise about 20 miles from the nearest town of Moulton. The GPS kept recalculating our route, sending us down increasingly narrow dirt roads that didn't match any of our paper maps. Jacob, who prided himself on his navigation skills, spent 40 minutes arguing with the device before finally throwing it into his backpack in disgust. "Technology's making us all stupid," he muttered, unfolding a topographical map. "My grandfather could navigate these woods with nothing but moss and the sun." Dennis laughed nervously. He'd been checking his phone obsessively since we'd left Birmingham, watching the signal bars disappear one by one. "When's the last time any of us actually used a paper map?" "About to find out," Ryan said, shouldering his pack. The grinding noise from my truck had stopped, but something about the sudden silence felt ominous rather than reassuring. We found the trailhead marker around 3 in the afternoon, a weathered wooden post with faded lettering that read, "Sipsey Wilderness, Backcountry Camping Permitted." Someone had carved additional words below the official text, but they were too worn to read clearly. The parking area was empty except for scattered beer cans and a single work boot that looked like it had been sitting there for months. The trail started pleasantly enough, winding through mixed hardwood forest with occasional glimpses of the limestone formations that made the area famous. The afternoon was warm, but not oppressive, with enough of a breeze to keep the mosquitoes at bay. Dennis took the lead, eager to show off his newly purchased hiking gear, while Jacob brought up the rear, occasionally consulting his compass and making notes in a waterproof journal. About 2 hours in, we encountered our first oddity. The trail simply ended. Not gradually, not splitting into multiple paths, but just stopped, as if whoever had been maintaining it had simply walked away mid-project. The GPS coordinates Ryan had copied from the forum should have led us another 1.5 miles to a designated camping area near a creek. "Maybe we missed a turn," Dennis suggested, though we all knew we hadn't. The path had been clear and well marked up until that point. Jacob studied his topographical map, rotating it to match the terrain. "According to this, the creek should be about 300 yards southwest of here. We can probably find it if we bushwhack." Ryan was already pushing through the underbrush, determined not to let a missing trail ruin his nature therapy. "Come on, it's an adventure. This is exactly what we came for." The forest changed character once we left the maintained trail. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into an eerie green twilight. The underbrush was dense and tangled, forcing us to move in single file and making conversation difficult. More concerning was the silence. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no buzz of insects. Just the sound of our breathing and the crack of twigs under our boots. We found the creek after an hour of difficult hiking, but it wasn't what any of us had expected. Instead of the clear, shallow stream described in Ryan's forum post, we encountered a sluggish brown waterway that smelled of decay. The water was perhaps 15 feet across and looked deep, with no obvious way to determine what lay beneath the murky surface. "This can't be right," Jacob said, consulting his map again. "The elevation's wrong, and the water should be running clear this time of year." Dennis knelt by the bank and immediately recoiled. "Jesus, it smells like something died in there." The smell was indeed overwhelming. Not just decay, but something more complex and disturbing. Sweet and metallic, with an undertone that made my stomach turn. Ryan, however, was undeterred. "Water's water," he said, setting down his pack. "There's a decent flat spot here for the tents, and we can filter what we need to drink. We've come too far to turn back now." Looking back, that was our first real mistake. We should have turned around the moment we smelled that water, but Ryan was going through hell with his divorce and none of us wanted to be the one to spoil his escape. So we made camp in a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek, far enough to minimize the smell but close enough to access water if needed. Setting up took longer than expected. The ground was harder than it looked, making it difficult to drive tent stakes, and the trees seemed positioned to block any logical tent placement. My tent, in particular, refused to cooperate. Every time I thought I had it properly staked, one corner would come loose, sending the whole structure into a lopsided mess. "Having trouble there, Mike?" Dennis called out, his own tent already standing perfectly. "Ground's like concrete," I muttered, though that wasn't entirely true. The earth felt wrong somehow. Too solid in some places, too soft in others, as if something large had been buried underneath and the soil hadn't quite settled properly. As evening approached, the temperature dropped more rapidly than any of us had anticipated. By the time we got our fire started, we were all wearing jackets despite the warm afternoon we'd enjoyed earlier. The fire itself was another oddity. No matter how we arranged the wood, the flames kept shifting color, sometimes normal orange and yellow, sometimes with hints of green and blue that none of us could explain. "Probably chemicals in the wood," Jacob said when I mentioned it. "Lot of industrial runoff in Alabama. Wouldn't be surprised if some of it made its way into the groundwater." The explanation made sense, but it didn't make the fire any less unsettling to watch. The colored flames seemed to move independently of the wind, occasionally flaring up in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Dinner was freeze-dried camping food that tasted like cardboard, but we were all hungry enough not to care. Ryan had brought a bottle of bourbon to christen the adventure, and we passed it around as the darkness settled in around our small circle of firelight. The alcohol helped with the cold and made the strange fire seem less ominous. It was Dennis who first mentioned the sounds. "You guys hear that?" he asked, setting down the bourbon bottle and tilting his head toward the forest. We all listened. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of our fire and the distant gurgle of the creek. Then, faintly, we heard what sounded like breaking branches coming from the direction we'd arrived from earlier. "Probably just a deer," Ryan said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sounds continued sporadically throughout the evening. Always distant, always from different directions, never quite identifiable. Sometimes they sounded like footsteps, sometimes like something large moving through the underbrush. Jacob suggested it might be a black bear, which were known to inhabit the area, but the sounds were too irregular, too purposeful for a foraging animal. We turned in around 11. Each of us secretly relieved to zip ourselves into our tents and escape the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the campsite. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds outside, the dying fire, the strange creak, and those intermittent crashing noises that seemed to be growing closer. I must have dozed off, because I was awakened by the sound of my tent zipper being slowly opened from the outside. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, not daring to breathe. The zipper continued its slow progress, the tiny metal teeth separating with barely audible clicks. Cool air flowed into the tent as the opening widened, carrying with it that same sweet, metallic smell from the creek. "Ryan," I whispered, hoping it was just one of my friends checking on me. The zipper stopped moving. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, and definitely not human. It was too deep, too measured, and there was a wet quality to it that made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers, trying not to make any noise. The breathing continued, coming from just outside my tent opening. I could sense a presence there, large and patient, waiting for something. The flashlight slipped from my hands and clattered against the tent floor. The breathing stopped immediately, followed by the sound of something large moving away quickly through the underbrush. I lay there for what felt like hours, clutching the flashlight and listening to my own heartbeat, before finally working up the courage to check the tent opening. The zipper was indeed partially open, about 6 inches, just as I'd heard. But when I examined it more closely with my flashlight, I found something that made my blood run cold. The fabric around the zipper was damp with a clear, viscous fluid that smelled like the creek. And there were marks in the dirt outside my tent. Not animal tracks, but long gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound from the forest around us. The strange noises continued until dawn, sometimes seeming to circle our campsite, sometimes coming from the direction of the creek. Once, I could have sworn I heard whispered voices, though I couldn't make out any words. Morning brought little relief. When I emerged from my tent, I found Jacob sitting by the cold remains of our fire, looking haggard and exhausted. "Rough night?" I asked. He nodded, stirring the ashes with a stick. "Kept hearing things. Thought I saw someone moving around camp around 3 a.m., but when I looked out of my tent, nobody was there." Dennis's tent was still zipped shut, and Ryan's was partially collapsed on one side. I was about to wake them both when Jacob grabbed my arm. "Mike, look at this." He pointed to the area around our fire pit. In the soft dirt, clearly visible in the morning light, were dozens of bare footprints. Not boot prints from our hiking shoes, but actual bare feet. They circled our campsite in a pattern that made no sense, sometimes overlapping, sometimes disappearing entirely, as if whoever had made them had occasionally walked on air. More disturbing were the prints themselves. They were roughly human-shaped but wrong in subtle ways. Too long, with toes that extended further than they should, and the depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than a normal person. What the hell were these things? Dennis's voice came from behind us. He'd emerged from his tent looking pale and shaken. "Where's Ryan?" I asked, noticing that his tent was now completely empty. We called his name several times, receiving no response. His sleeping bag was still in the tent, unzipped from the inside, and his boots were missing. Most of his gear was still there, including his wallet and car keys. "Maybe he went to get water," Dennis suggested, though none of us believed it. We searched the immediate area around our campsite, calling Ryan's name and listening for any response. The forest remained eerily quiet, that same unnatural silence we'd noticed the day before. After an hour with no sign of him, we decided to pack up and look for help. That's when we discovered our next problem. Jacob's compass was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. My watch had stopped sometime during the night, and both Dennis's phone and Jacob's GPS unit were completely dead despite being fully charged the night before. "We follow the creek," Jacob decided. "Water always leads somewhere, and we know which direction we came from yesterday." But when we reached the creek, we found that it had changed. The sluggish brown water had become a rushing torrent, easily twice as wide as the night before and running in the opposite direction. The smell of decay was stronger, almost overwhelming, and the water had taken on a reddish tint that made all of us step back from the bank. "This isn't possible," Dennis said, his voice cracking. "Creeks don't just change direction overnight." Jacob was studying his topographical map again, but I could see the confusion and growing panic in his eyes. "None of this makes sense. According to every map I have, we shouldn't be anywhere near running water this size." We spent the morning trying to retrace our route from the previous day, but the forest seemed to have rearranged itself during the night. Landmarks we remembered were gone, replaced by identical stands of trees that offered no useful navigation reference. The trail we'd bushwhacked through to reach the creek had vanished entirely, leaving only unbroken wilderness in every direction. It was around noon when we heard Ryan calling for help. His voice came from the direction of the creek, faint but unmistakably his. We ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and calling his name. When we reached the water's edge, we could see him on the opposite bank, about 100 yards downstream from where we'd made camp. He was standing perfectly still, facing away from us, wearing only his underwear and hiking boots. His skin was pale and had an odd, waxy appearance, and he wasn't responding to our shouts. "Ryan!" Dennis yelled. "What happened? How did you get over there?" Ryan slowly turned toward us, and even from that distance we could see that something was fundamentally wrong. His movements were too smooth, too controlled, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd never seen a human walk before. When he faced us fully, I could see that he was smiling, but it was the wrong kind of smile. Too wide, held too long, without any warmth or recognition in his eyes. "I'm fine," he called back, but his voice sounded flat and emotionless. "Just gathering firewood. I'll be back soon." Jacob cupped his hands around his mouth. "The water's too dangerous to cross. We'll find another way around." Ryan didn't respond. He simply turned away from us and walked into the forest, moving with that same unnatural smoothness. We could see his pale form between the trees for several minutes before he disappeared entirely. "That wasn't Ryan," Dennis said quietly. "Don't be ridiculous," Jacob snapped, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "He's probably in shock. People do weird things when they're hypothermic." I wanted to agree with Jacob, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Dennis was right. Everything about Ryan's appearance and behavior had been wrong. The way he moved, the way he spoke, even the way he stood. It was as if something had put on Ryan's body like a costume and was still learning how to operate it. We spent the rest of the day trying to find a way across the creek, following it both upstream and downstream without success. The water was simply too deep and fast-moving, and none of us were strong enough swimmers to risk it. As evening approached, we made the decision to set up camp again and try to signal for help. Jacob had brought a small emergency mirror for signaling aircraft, but the thick canopy made it useless. Dennis tried to build a signal fire, but the smoke never seemed to rise above the treetops. Everything we tried seemed to be absorbed by the forest itself, as if the wilderness was actively working against our rescue. That second night was worse than the first. The sounds started earlier and were more aggressive. Heavy footsteps circling our campsite, branches breaking, and what sounded like voices mimicking our earlier conversations. At one point, I heard Dennis calling for help from somewhere in the forest, but when I checked, he was sound asleep in his tent just 10 feet away. Around midnight, Ryan returned. I was on watch duty when I saw him walking out of the tree line. He was still wearing only his underwear and boots, and his skin had taken on an even more unnatural pallor. He moved directly to the remains of our fire and stood there, swaying slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Ryan," I called softly, not wanting to wake the others. He turned toward me with that same too wide smile. "Hello, Michael. I've been waiting for you." His voice was definitely Ryan's, but the cadence was all wrong. He spoke too slowly, pausing in strange places as if he was translating from another language in his head. "Where have you been? We've been looking for you all day." "I've been learning," he said, taking a step closer to my tent. "There's so much to learn here. The forest has so many secrets." I reached for my flashlight, but Ryan held up a hand to stop me. "Please don't. The light hurts now. It's better in the dark." Something about his tone made me lower the flashlight without turning it on. Even in the dim starlight filtering through the canopy, I could see that Ryan's eyes reflected light like an animal's. They were definitely his eyes, but they seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescence that made my skin crawl. "Ryan, you're scaring me. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" He tilted his head to one side, considering the question. "I'm not hurt. I'm changing. The forest is helping me change into something better." "What do you mean?" "You'll understand soon. All of you will understand. The forest is hungry, Michael. It's been hungry for a long time, and we're going to help feed it." I wanted to wake Jacob and Dennis, but Ryan was standing between me and their tents. He seemed to sense my intentions and smiled even wider, revealing teeth that looked too sharp in the dim light. "Don't wake them yet. Let them rest. They'll need their strength for tomorrow." "What happens tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we go deeper into the forest. Tomorrow we find the place where the old things sleep. Tomorrow we become part of something much larger than ourselves." Ryan turned and walked back into the tree line, moving with that same unnatural grace. This time, I didn't lose sight of him until he was completely swallowed by the darkness. I sat awake for the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and trying to convince myself that I'd been dreaming. Morning brought another shock. When Jacob and Dennis emerged from their tents, I told them about Ryan's visit. They listened with growing alarm, but when we examined the area where he'd been standing, there were no footprints. The ground around our campsite was soft enough to show every step we'd taken, but there was no trace of Ryan's presence. "You were dreaming," Jacob said firmly. "Stress and lack of sleep can cause incredibly vivid hallucinations." I wanted to believe him, but I knew what I'd seen. Ryan had been there, changed into something that wasn't quite human anymore, and he'd promised to return. We spent the third day trying to build a more permanent signal fire and rationing our food. Our water was running low, despite the proximity of the creek. None of us wanted to drink from that foul-smelling torrent, and the purification tablets we'd brought seemed ineffective against whatever was contaminating it. Dennis was showing signs of severe stress. He'd barely slept in 2 days and was jumping at every sound. Jacob was trying to maintain his role as the practical one, but I could see cracks in his composure. He checked his compass obsessively, even though it continued to spin wildly, and he'd started talking to himself while studying his maps. That afternoon, we heard helicopter rotors in the distance. All three of us rushed to create as much smoke and noise as possible, but the aircraft passed overhead without slowing. Looking up through the canopy, I caught a brief glimpse of it through the leaves. A military helicopter flying much too low and fast for a normal patrol. "They're looking for us," Dennis shouted, but his excitement quickly faded as the sound disappeared. Jacob was shaking his head. That wasn't a search pattern. They were heading somewhere specific. As if to confirm his observation, we heard explosions in the distance. 3 sharp detonations, spaced about a minute apart, coming from somewhere northeast of our position. They were followed by the sound of more helicopters, this time moving in formation. "What the hell is going on out there?" Dennis demanded. None of us had an answer, but the military activity made our situation feel even more desperate. If they were conducting operations in the area, it meant we were probably in some kind of danger zone. It also meant that any normal search and rescue efforts were likely suspended. As evening approached, we made the decision to try walking out the next morning, regardless of our navigation problems. We'd been in the forest for 3 days without making any progress toward civilization, and our supplies were running critically low. That night, Ryan returned with company. I was on watch again when they emerged from the tree line. Ryan was leading a group of 3 other figures, all moving with that same unnatural smoothness. In the dim firelight, I could see that the others were wearing the remnants of hiking gear, but their clothes were torn and stained with something dark. The group stopped at the edge of our campsite, just outside the circle of firelight. Ryan stepped forward, and I could see that his transformation had progressed. His skin was now completely pale, almost translucent, and his limbs seemed longer than they should be. When he smiled, his teeth had become sharp, predatory points. "Michael," he said in that slow, careful voice, "I've brought friends. They're going to help us with tomorrow's journey." I reached for my flashlight, but one of the other figures moved faster than should have been possible. Before I could react, pale hands had torn the light from my grasp and crushed it like paper. In the sudden darkness, I could hear Jacob and Dennis stirring in their tents. "What's happening?" Jacob called out. "Stay in your tents," I shouted, but it was too late. Both of them were already unzipping their tent flaps. The moment they emerged, the figures rushed forward. There was no sound except for a wet, tearing noise and 2 brief, cut-off screams. When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see Jacob and Dennis being dragged into the forest by the pale figures. They were alive, but unresponsive, their eyes vacant and staring. Ryan approached my tent, moving with deliberate slowness. "Don't be afraid, Michael, they're not gone. They're changing, just like I did, just like you will." "What did you do to them?" "I gave them a gift. The gift of becoming something more than human. Something that can survive in places where humans can't. Something that can feed on things humans can't digest." I backed away from him, fumbling for my hiking knife. "Stay away from me." Ryan laughed, and the sound was nothing like his normal laugh. It was hollow and echoing, as if it was coming from somewhere much deeper than his throat. "You can't run from this place, Michael. The forest won't let you leave. It's been calling to you since you arrived, and now it's time to answer." He reached toward me with hands that had grown too long, fingers that ended in sharp, yellowed nails. I slashed at him with my knife, opening a deep gash across his forearm. Instead of blood, a thick, clear fluid leaked from the wound. Ryan looked at the cut with mild interest, as if it had happened to someone else. "That used to hurt," he said thoughtfully. "I remember pain. I remember a lot of things that don't matter anymore." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, driven by pure terror. Behind me, I could hear Ryan calling my name in that patient, emotionless voice. He wasn't pursuing me urgently. He was following at a steady pace, as if he knew exactly where I was going. I ran for what felt like hours, stumbling through the dark forest. My flashlight was destroyed, and the canopy blocked out most of the starlight. I was navigating by feel and instinct, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever Ryan had become. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I found myself in a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree that seemed older than the surrounding forest. Its trunk was easily 8 feet in diameter, and its branches formed a natural shelter. I pressed my back against the bark and tried to catch my breath. That's when I noticed the carvings. The entire base of the tree was covered in symbols and words carved deep into the bark. Some of them looked old, weathered by decades of exposure, while others appeared fresh. Many were in languages I didn't recognize, but scattered among them were English words and phrases that made my blood run cold. The forest hunger never stops. They took Sarah. She came back wrong. Don't trust the ones who return. Burning is the only way. And carved most recently, in letters that still wept sap, Ryan Mitchell, changed October 15th. That was yesterday's date. I realized I was looking at a warning system. Previous visitors to this area had encountered the same thing we had, and they'd left messages for whoever came after them. Reading through the carvings, I began to piece together a horrifying pattern. People had been coming to this area for years, maybe decades, and disappearing. Some, like Ryan, returned changed into something else. Others were never seen again. The few who escaped had tried to warn future victims by carving their experiences into this tree. One message, carved in shaky letters, provided the most useful information. Thing in ground. Big cave southeast. Iron and fire. Stop it. I remembered the military helicopters and explosions from earlier. Someone in authority knew about this place and was trying to deal with it. That meant there might be a way out, but I had to avoid whatever was in that cave. I spent the rest of the night at the base of the tree, reading every carving I could make out and trying to form a plan. According to the messages, the thing controlling this area was vulnerable to iron and fire. I had my hiking knife, which was steel, and I still had my waterproof matches in my jacket pocket. As dawn broke, I heard Ryan calling for me again. His voice was closer than I'd expected, coming from just beyond the tree line. I pressed myself against the trunk and tried to remain perfectly still. Michael, you can't hide forever. The forest knows where you are. It can smell your fear, taste your desperation. Come out and let us help you change. His voice was different now, deeper with harmonic overtones that didn't sound human. When he stepped into the clearing, I could see that his transformation was nearly complete. His skin had become translucent enough that I could see dark veins and organs moving underneath. His limbs had stretched until he was nearly 7 feet tall, and his fingers had grown into claws. I can smell the iron you're carrying, he said, tilting his head in my direction. It won't help you. Nothing can help you now. I gripped my knife and tried to think of a plan. Ryan was between me and the only exit from the clearing, and he was obviously much stronger and faster than me, but he was talking instead of attacking, which suggested he wanted something from me besides just transformation. What do you want, Ryan? I want you to understand. I want you to see what I've seen. The thing that lives beneath this place is older than human civilization. It's been waiting for so long, feeding on the occasional lost hiker or hunter. But it's growing stronger now, and it needs more food. You're helping it kill people. I'm helping it evolve. We all are. Everyone who gets changed becomes part of something larger, something that can exist in places where humans would die. We're the next step in evolution, Michael. Ryan took a step closer, and I could see that his eyes had changed color. Instead of brown, they were now a pale yellow with vertical pupils like a snake's. The military knows about it, I said, hoping to shake his confidence. They were bombing the area yesterday. Ryan's smile widened, revealing multiple rows of sharp teeth. They've been trying to kill it for 40 years. Napalm, conventional explosives, even a small nuclear device in 1987. Nothing works. It just goes deeper underground and waits for them to leave. That explained the military activity, but it also meant I couldn't count on any outside help. Whatever was happening here was beyond normal human ability to stop. The tree has iron in it, I lied, hoping to buy time. That's why the messages are here. Iron in the bark protects this spot." Ryan paused, considering this. "Iron hurts it, but it doesn't stop it. Nothing stops it permanently. Then why are you helping it? Because the alternative is death. At least this way, part of who I was continues to exist." I could hear something moving in the forest around us. More of the changed humans, probably Jacob and Dennis, closing in to cut off any escape route. My time was running out. That's when I remembered something from one of the tree carvings. Burning is the only way. I pulled out my waterproof matches with my free hand. "Stay back, or I'll burn this whole forest down." Ryan laughed that hollow, echoing laugh. "Fire won't stop us. We're not really alive anymore." "Maybe not, but it'll hurt the thing underground. That's why the military used napalm." For the first time since his transformation began, Ryan looked uncertain. "You wouldn't. You'd die too." "Better than becoming like you." I struck a match and held it near some dry leaves at the base of the tree. The flame caught immediately, spreading to the leaf litter and climbing up the trunk toward the lower branches. Ryan screamed, and it was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. It started human, but quickly became something else. A wailing, harmonic shriek that seemed to come from the earth itself. He rushed toward me, claws extended, but the spreading fire made him hesitate. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. I dove to one side, rolling away from the tree and coming up running. Behind me, Ryan's screams were joined by others as the fire spread. The forest was dry despite the morning dew, and the flames moved faster than I would have believed possible. I ran toward what I hoped was northeast, away from the cave mentioned in the tree carvings. The fire was spreading behind me, and I could hear inhuman voices wailing in pain and rage. The changed humans were following me, but they seemed sluggish and disoriented, as if the fire was affecting their connection to whatever controlled them. I ran for miles, following deer paths and creek beds, always moving uphill when possible. The fire was pursuing me, but slowly enough that I could stay ahead of it. More importantly, the changed humans had stopped following entirely. Whatever held them together seemed to be breaking down as the flames consumed more of the forest. It was late afternoon when I finally saw the helicopter. It was a military transport flying low and slow in a search pattern. I made it to a rocky outcrop that gave me a clear view of the sky and started waving my arms frantically. The pilot spotted me and set down in a small meadow about half a mile away. The soldiers who pulled me aboard were grim-faced and efficient. They didn't ask many questions during the flight out, but I could see the massive forest fire burning behind us. It covered at least 20 square miles and was still spreading. "You're lucky to be alive," the medic said as he treated my burns and cuts. "That fire started fast and moved faster. Most people would have been trapped." I didn't tell him that I'd started the fire. I didn't tell him about Ryan or the others or the thing living in the caves. I just said that my friends had been killed in an accident and that I'd been trying to hike out for help when the fire started. They transported me to a military hospital near Huntsville, where I spent 2 weeks recovering from my injuries. During that time, I learned that the Sipsey Wilderness Fire had burned for 6 days before finally being contained. The official cause was listed as lightning strike, though there had been no storms in the area. More interesting was what they found after the fire. Emergency teams discovered the remains of at least 30 people scattered throughout the burned area. Most were identified as missing hikers and hunters dating back over 20 years. 3 sets of remains were too old to identify and showed signs of unusual bone structure that the coroners couldn't explain. They also found the cave system. According to the reports I was able to access later, it extended for miles underground, with passages that seemed to have been artificially expanded. The deepest chambers contained evidence of habitation, but whatever had lived there was gone. The heat from the fire had apparently penetrated deep enough to force it to abandon its lair. Jacob, Dennis, and Ryan were never found. Not even bones. It's possible they were completely consumed by the fire, or maybe they escaped deeper underground. I prefer to think they were consumed. The alternative is that they're still out there somewhere, changed into something that's no longer human but carrying enough of their original personalities to remember me. I've moved twice since returning to Birmingham, and I never go camping anymore. I avoid forests entirely, sticking to cities and open spaces where I can see any threats coming. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear Ryan calling my name in that patient, emotionless voice. When that happens, I check all my locks and windows, and I keep a knife and a lighter close at hand, because fire might not stop them permanently, but it's the only thing they fear. And if they ever come looking for me again, I'll burn down whatever I have to in order to stop them. The forest may be gone, but some hungers never die. They just find new places to feed. This account was written 3 weeks after the events described. Michael Williams has since relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where he works as a software engineer. The Sipsey Wilderness remains closed to public access, officially due to ongoing restoration efforts following the 2025 fire. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Sipsey Wilderness of Alabama's Bankhead National Forest, during what was supposed to be a simple team-building camping trip with my coworkers from the insurance firm. The four of us, Jessica Davis, Brian Wright, Angela Roberts, and myself, had driven down from Birmingham on a Friday afternoon in October. Our boss thought it would boost morale after the brutal quarterly reports. None of us were exactly outdoorsmen, but the Sipsey Wilderness seemed manageable enough. 25,000 acres of protected forest with designated camping areas and well-marked trails. What could go wrong? I should have paid attention to the locals in Double Springs when we stopped for supplies. The way the cashier at the hardware store stared when Brian mentioned where we were headed. How she lingered over our transaction, her weathered fingers trembling slightly as she bagged our batteries and camp stove fuel. The silence that fell over the diner when Jessica asked about good hiking spots in the area. "Y'all be careful up there," the waitress had said, refilling my coffee with unnecessary force. "Things get strange in them woods when the leaves start falling." We laughed it off, city folk dismissing rural superstitions. God, we were idiots. The drive into the forest took longer than expected. Our GPS kept losing signal, rerouting us down increasingly narrow dirt roads that seemed to twist back on themselves. By the time we found the trailhead for the Sipsey River Trail, the sun was already low, casting long shadows through the pine and hardwood forest. "Should we maybe find a closer camping spot?" Jessica asked, checking her phone for the dozenth time. No bars, naturally. Brian was already shouldering his pack, grinning with the forced enthusiasm of someone determined to make the best of things. "Come on, Davis. Where's your sense of adventure? Besides, we've got permits for the backcountry site up by Thompson Creek. We'll be fine." Angela adjusted her designer hiking boots, still pristine from the sporting goods store, and nodded. "The brochure said it's only 3 miles. We can make that before dark, right?" The trail started easily enough, following the Sipsey River through relatively open forest. The water ran clear and cold, bubbling over limestone rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Massive beech trees towered overhead, their leaves just beginning to turn yellow and orange. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But something felt wrong from the moment we stepped into those woods. It was subtle at first. The way the forest sounds seemed muted, as if we were walking through cotton. The occasional snap of twigs that had nothing to do with our footsteps. The feeling of being watched that made the skin between my shoulder blades crawl with imaginary insects. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" I asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. Jessica paused, tilting her head. "Now that you mention it, where are all the birds?" We stood in the growing gloom, listening. Nothing. No birdsong, no squirrel chatter, no insect drone. Just the sound of water over stone and our own labored breathing. "Probably just the season," Brian said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Migrating south or whatever." The trail began to climb, winding away from the river and up into the hills. Ancient rock formations jutted from the earth like broken teeth, covered in moss that glowed an unnatural green in the fading light. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so thick that twilight came early. My headlamp beam seemed weaker than it should have been, absorbed by the forest rather than illuminating it. The cone of light revealed maybe 10 feet ahead before being swallowed by darkness so complete it felt solid. There, Angela pointed ahead with a shaky hand. I think I see the creek. Thompson Creek was more of a trickle, really, a narrow stream that wound through a small clearing dotted with ancient fire rings. Our designated campsite. We set up our tents in a rough circle, the blue and orange nylon incongruously bright against the dark trees. God, I'm starving, Jessica said, pulling out her camp stove. Who wants to gather some firewood while I get dinner started? I was about to volunteer when Brian held up his hand. I've got it. Need to stretch my legs anyway. He grabbed his headlamp and headed toward the tree line. Back in 20. That was 7:43 p.m. I know because I checked my watch, worried about how quickly full darkness was falling. By 8:15, Jessica was pacing around the fire pit, her pot of water boiling ignored on the camp stove. Where the hell is he? She muttered. It doesn't take 40 minutes to collect some dead branches. Angela sat on a fallen log, hugging her knees. She'd been unusually quiet since we'd made camp, jumping at every small sound. Maybe we should call out for him. Brian! Jessica cupped her hands around her mouth. Brian! Her voice echoed off the surrounding hills, distorted and strange. For a moment we thought we heard an answer, a distant call that might have been his voice, but it came from the wrong direction, deeper in the forest, and it didn't sound quite right. The timber was off, too high and reedy. That wasn't him, I said, though I couldn't explain why I was so certain. We waited another hour, taking turns calling his name and venturing short distances into the woods with our flashlights. The forest seemed to absorb our lights and voices, giving nothing back. No response, no echo, just that oppressive silence. We should go back to the car, Angela said. Her face was pale in the flickering light of our camp stove. Call for help. And leave Brian out there? Jessica shook her head. No way. He probably just got turned around, lost his bearings in the dark. I wanted to agree with Angela, but the thought of hiking 3 miles through that darkness, with whatever was out there watching us, made my stomach clench with primal fear. At least here we had fire, light, the illusion of safety. We'll wait until morning, I decided. If he's not back by first light, we'll hike out and get help. None of us slept well that night. The forest pressed in around our small circle of light, alive with sounds that didn't belong, footsteps that might have been settling branches, whispers that could have been wind through the leaves. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, listening to Jessica's restless turning in the tent next to mine. Angela had moved her sleeping bag closer to the dying fire, unwilling to be alone in the dark. Around 3 a.m., I heard Angela gasp. Did you guys hear that? We all sat up, listening. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of someone moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through dead leaves. Brian, Jessica called softly. The footsteps stopped. Brian, is that you? A voice answered from the darkness beyond our camp. Yeah, it's me. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by unease. Something about his tone was wrong, flat, emotionless, and he sounded closer than he should have been, given that the footsteps had stopped. Jesus, man, where have you been? I called out, unzipping my tent. We've been worried sick. Brian stepped into the circle of light cast by our dying fire, and my blood turned to ice. He looked like Brian, same height, same build, same receding hairline and wire-rimmed glasses. But his clothes were wrong, too clean for someone who'd been lost in the woods all night. His posture was off, too straight and rigid, and his eyes. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. Got turned around, he said in that same flat tone. Dark out there. Jessica was already out of her tent, moving toward him with obvious relief. Thank God you're okay. We were about to... She stopped mid-sentence, close enough now to see what I was seeing. Brian's face was slack, expressionless. His mouth hung slightly open, and when he blinked, it was slow and deliberate, like he had to consciously remember how to do it. "Brian?" Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Are you feeling all right?" He turned his head toward her with mechanical precision, his neck rotating too far to the left before snapping back to center. The movement was subtly wrong, like watching a marionette operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Fine," he said. "I'm fine." But the word stretched too long. The I sound distorted into something that raised goosebumps along my arms. Angela had backed up against a tree, her sleeping bag clutched to her chest like armor. "That's not Brian," she whispered. The thing wearing Brian's face turned toward her, and for just a moment its features shifted. The skin rippled like water, revealing something else underneath, something with too many teeth and eyes that burned yellow in the darkness. Then it smiled Brian's smile, but wrong, with too much gum showing and lips that stretched a fraction too wide. "Of course I'm Brian," it said, and now its voice had the right inflection, the right warmth. Perfect mimicry. "Who else would I be?" Jessica looked between us, confusion and growing fear warring on her face. "Guys, what are you talking about? It's obviously Brian. He's just tired, shaken up from being lost." The not Brian thing tilted its head, studying her with predatory interest. "That's right, Jess. Just tired." It had never called her Jess before. Brian always used her full name, a quirk we'd joked about at the office. But Jessica didn't seem to notice, her worry overriding her caution. "Come sit by the fire," she said, patting the log beside her. "You must be freezing." I wanted to scream at her, to grab her and run, but my voice seemed frozen in my throat. The thing wearing Brian's skin moved toward the fire with that same mechanical precision, its limbs moving just slightly out of sync with each other. As it sat down beside Jessica, I caught a smell that made my stomach heave. The sweet, cloying scent of decay, like fruit left too long in the sun. Jessica wrinkled her nose but didn't move away. "Brian, you smell like—" she began. "Like what?" Its voice was sharper now, defensive. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just different." It stared at her for a long moment, and I saw its fingers twitch as if it were fighting the urge to reach out and touch her. When it spoke again, its voice had returned to that perfect mimicry of Brian's tone. "Sorry, got into some kind of mud out there. Probably rotting leaves or something." Angela was still pressed against the tree, her eyes wide with terror. She caught my gaze and mouthed a single word. "Run." But before I could move, the not Brian thing was talking again, its attention focused entirely on Jessica. "You know, Jess, I was thinking about what you said earlier, about the quarterly reports." Jessica frowned. "I didn't say anything about the quarterly reports." "Sure you did." Its smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp. "Right before we left the office. You said we should discuss them privately." "Brian, I never—" Its hand shot out faster than a striking snake, gripping Jessica's wrist with enough force to make her gasp. The sound that came from its throat wasn't quite human, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air. "Don't lie to me," it said, and now its voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. Jessica tried to pull away, but its grip tightened. I could see her bones grinding together under its fingers. "Brian, you're hurting me." That broke my paralysis. I lunged forward, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and swinging it at the thing's head. It released Jessica and spun toward me with inhuman speed, its face contorting into something that had never been human. The features were all wrong now. Too many teeth crowding a mouth that opened like a bear trap, eyes that burned yellow and moved independently of each other, skin that rippled and shifted like it couldn't decide what shape to take. It let out a sound that was part scream, part roar, part something else entirely, a noise that seemed to come from the earth itself, full of rage and hunger and terrible, alien intelligence. Jessica scrambled backward, finally understanding what she was seeing. Angela broke from her paralysis and ran, crashing through the underbrush toward the trail. I swung the burning branch again, catching the creature across what might have been its shoulder. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, but the creature barely flinched. It backhanded me with casual strength, sending me flying into a tree trunk hard enough to drive the air from my lungs. Stars exploded across my vision, and I tasted blood. When my vision cleared, the creature was advancing on Jessica, who was scrambling across the ground on her hands and knees, trying to reach her tent. It moved with predatory grace now, no longer bothering to maintain Brian's awkward human gait. "Where are you going, Jess?" it asked in Brian's voice, hideously cheerful. "I thought we were going to discuss those reports." Jessica reached her tent and dove inside, frantically zipping the door shut as if nylon could protect her from the thing outside. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and extended one finger that had grown into a claw. With surgical precision, it traced a line down the tent wall. The fabric parted like water, revealing Jessica huddled inside, clutching a can of bear spray. "That won't work on me," the creature said conversationally. "I'm not really a bear." Jessica triggered the spray anyway, filling the tent with capsaicin mist. The creature inhaled deeply and sighed with what sounded like pleasure. "Spicy," it said, and reached for her. I forced myself to move, my ribs screaming with every breath. My headlamp had fallen nearby, its beam cutting through the chaos. I grabbed it and aimed it directly at the creature's face. It shrieked and recoiled, its form wavering like heat shimmer. The light seemed to hurt it, or at least confuse it, causing its stolen features to shift and blur. "Jessica, move!" I shouted. She rolled out of the destroyed tent, still clutching the bear spray. Together, we backed toward the creek, keeping the light trained on the creature. It followed but maintained its distance, circling us like a shark. "What do you want?" I gasped. It stopped circling and regarded me with those burning yellow eyes. When it spoke, it was in Brian's voice again, but the words came out wrong, in the wrong order, like someone reading a script they didn't understand. Hungry for the warm red inside. Its face shifted again, cycling through features I didn't recognize. A woman with long black hair, an old man with a beard, a child with two wide eyes. Finally, it settled back into Brian's appearance, but the illusion was imperfect now. The eyes were still wrong, and its mouth moved out of sync with its words. "I've been so hungry," it said. "So very hungry, and you smell so warm." Angela's scream echoed from somewhere in the forest, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly in a wet, choking noise. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and for a moment, its attention was entirely focused on the darkness beyond our camp. That's when Jessica made her move. She lunged forward with the bear spray, emptying the entire can directly into the creature's face at point-blank range. This time, the reaction was more dramatic. It stumbled backward, clawing at its eyes and making sounds like a scalded cat. "Run!" Jessica grabbed my arm, hauling me toward the trail. We crashed through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, the creature's roars of rage and pain echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of pursuit, something large and fast moving through the underbrush, gaining on us with every second. My headlamp beam bounced wildly as we ran, revealing glimpses of the path ahead. We had maybe 100 yards on it, but that lead was shrinking fast. I could hear its breathing now, harsh and labored, and underneath that, a sound like wet meat slapping against stone. "There," Jessica pointed ahead. "The river." The Sipsey River cut across our path, its dark water reflecting our light. Without hesitation, Jessica plunged in, the current immediately catching her and sweeping her downstream. I followed, the icy water shocking my system and numbing my battered ribs. The creature burst from the tree line just as the current carried us around a bend. Its howl of frustration echoed off the canyon walls, but it didn't follow us into the water. Maybe it couldn't swim, or maybe running water was another weakness, like the light. We let the current carry us for what felt like miles, occasionally grabbing at overhanging branches to slow our progress. The water was freezing, leaching the heat from our bodies, but it was better than what was waiting for us back there. Finally, we managed to drag ourselves onto a gravel bar, shivering and exhausted. My watch said 4:17 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. "Angela," Jessica whispered through chattering teeth. "Oh, God, Angela." I put my arm around her, as much for my own comfort as hers. We both knew what that scream had meant. Whatever had happened to the real Brian was now happening to Angela. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Get to the car, call for help. The trail's back that way." Jessica pointed upstream toward where the creature was still hunting. "We'll never make it past that thing." I tried to think, to remember the map we'd studied before the hike. The Sipsey River eventually joined the Mulberry Fork, which ran closer to the main road. If we followed the water downstream instead of trying to backtrack— "We follow the river," I said. "It has to lead somewhere." We started walking, using the moonlight to navigate the rocky shoreline. Every shadow could hide the creature, every sound could be its approach. But as the hours passed and nothing emerged from the darkness, I began to hope we might actually make it out alive. That hope died when we saw the smoke. It was just after sunrise, thin tendrils rising from somewhere ahead. As we got closer, we could smell it. Not just wood smoke, but something else burning. Something that smelled like meat. "We should go around," Jessica whispered, but I was already seeing the orange glow through the trees, hearing the crackle of flames. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I pushed through the undergrowth toward the source of the smoke. It was a small clearing, maybe 50 yards across. In the center, a fire burned. Not a campfire, but a bonfire, built from what looked like entire trees, and suspended over the flames. I turned away, retching. Jessica wasn't so lucky. She saw it all before I could stop her. What was left of Angela, and probably the real Brian too, arranged in positions that were both ritualistic and deliberately grotesque. "Oh, God," she sobbed. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God." A sound made us both freeze, applause, slow and deliberate. The creature emerged from the trees opposite us, still wearing Brian's face but no longer bothering to hide its true nature. Its limbs were too long now, its joints bending in ways that human bones couldn't accommodate. "Beautiful, isn't it?" it said in a voice that was no longer entirely Brian's. "The fire cleanses them, prepares them, makes the warm red inside so much sweeter." It began to circle the clearing, moving with that same predatory grace. We backed toward the tree line, but I could see other shapes moving in the shadows. More of them, or maybe just one creature that could be in multiple places at once. "You led us right to them, you know," it continued conversationally. "Following the water, just like prey animals always do. So predictable." A branch snapped behind us. Jessica spun around and I saw her face go white. Another one stood there, this time wearing Angela's appearance but wrong, with her head tilted at an impossible angle and her arms hanging loose at her sides. "Hello, Jessica," it said in Angela's voice. "Want to join us by the fire?" We were surrounded. I could see at least 3 of them now, maybe more. They were herding us toward the bonfire, toward whatever ritual they had planned for us. That's when I remembered something, the way the first creature had recoiled from my headlamp, how the light had disrupted its form. My flashlight was waterlogged and dead, but my phone. I pulled it out, praying the waterproof case had done its job. The screen flickered to life, its LED flash bright in the dim morning light. I activated the camera and turned on the continuous flash. The effect was immediate. All 3 creatures shrieked and stumbled backward, their stolen forms wavering like mirages. The Angela thing's head snapped back to its proper position, while the Brian thing's 2 long limbs contracted painfully. "The light!" I shouted to Jessica. "Your phone!" She fumbled for her device, her hands shaking badly. The screen was cracked but functional. Soon we had 2 sources of strobing LED light, creating a small bubble of safety in the clearing. The creatures circled us but kept their distance, making sounds of frustration and rage. They were beautiful in a terrible way, constantly shifting, their true forms visible now as amalgamations of fur and scale and teeth, all held together by some malevolent intelligence. "We can't keep this up forever," Jessica said through gritted teeth. "The batteries—" She was right. Already my phone was showing low power warnings. We had maybe an hour before the lights died, and then I looked around desperately for another option and saw it. The fire. It was burning hot and bright, fed by enough wood to last hours. Fire was light, and light was what we needed. "The bonfire," I said. "We need to get to the bonfire." Jessica looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you insane? That's where the light will keep them back. We can wait for help, signal for rescue." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. Keeping our phones' strobes active, we began moving toward the center of the clearing. The creatures followed but maintained their distance, occasionally darting forward to test our defenses. We made it to within 10 feet of the fire when my phone died. The creatures surged forward immediately, but Jessica's light held them back. Barely. I could see them more clearly now, see how they weren't really individual entities but parts of something larger, connected by threads of shadow that stretched between them. "Michael," Jessica's voice was strained. 20% battery. We were going to die here. I could see it in the creatures' burning eyes, hear it in their otherworldly howls. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I grabbed a burning branch from the edge of the bonfire, swinging it in wide arcs to keep the creatures at bay. The flames worked almost as well as the LED light, causing them to hiss and retreat. "Get more," I shouted to Jessica. "Anything that burns." Together, we created a ring of fire around ourselves, using burning branches and logs from the bonfire. The creatures paced around our makeshift fortification, their forms flickering between human and something else entirely. As the sun climbed higher, their movements became more sluggish. The light seemed to weaken them, or at least make it harder for them to maintain coherent forms. By full daylight, they had retreated to the shadows at the edge of the clearing, watching us with hateful patience. "They're waiting for night," Jessica said. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her designer hiking clothes torn and filthy. "When it gets dark again—" I didn't want to think about that. Instead, I focused on feeding our ring of fire, keeping the flames high and bright. Every few minutes, one of the creatures would test our defenses, darting forward only to retreat when the fire flared. Around noon, we heard it, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Someone had noticed we were missing, had sent search and rescue. I grabbed my shirt and waved it overhead, shouting at the top of my lungs. The helicopter circled the clearing twice before finding a place to land. 2 rangers and a paramedic jumped out, weapons drawn as they took in the scene. The bonfire, the remains, Jessica and me huddled behind our wall of flame. "Jesus Christ," one of them breathed. "What happened here?" I tried to explain, but the words came out as babbling nonsense. How do you tell someone about creatures that wear human faces, that hunt in the darkness and feed on something more than flesh? The rangers found evidence of Angela and Brian, or what was left of them. The official report would list their deaths as animal attacks, probably bears. The strange burns on the trees, the way the remains were arranged. All of that would be attributed to unknown scavengers and natural decomposition. They flew us out that afternoon, Jessica to the hospital for shock and hypothermia, me to the police station for questioning. I told them about Brian getting lost, about finding his body in the clearing. I left out the part about what had worn his face afterward. Jessica and I never talked about what really happened that night. She quit the insurance company a week later and moved to Florida. I heard she changed careers entirely, became a teacher or something, as far away from wilderness areas as she could get. I stayed in Birmingham, but I've never been camping since. Can't even look at a forest without feeling that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, the certainty that something is watching from the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that clearing, about the fire and the creatures circling just beyond the light. In my dreams, they're still there, waiting patiently for the flames to die down. And sometimes, when I'm walking downtown or sitting in a restaurant, I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks familiar. Same height, same build, same face. But when I look closer, something is always slightly wrong. The way they move, the way they blink, the way their smile stretches just a little too wide. I've learned to recognize the signs now. The flat, emotionless stare. The way they tilt their heads when they're listening. The smell of decay that follows them like cologne. They're spreading, adapting, learning to live among us. And I'm the only one who knows what they really are. The only one left alive anyway. Last week, I saw Brian's face on the evening news. He was running for city council, shaking hands and kissing babies. His campaign slogan promising to bring fresh blood to local politics. He looked exactly the same as he had that night in the woods, except now his mimicry was perfect. No one watching would ever suspect that the thing behind those wire-rimmed glasses had never been human at all. I called the news station, tried to warn them, but they thought I was just another crank caller. The reporter hung up on me when I started talking about creatures in the woods, about things that steal faces and hunt in the darkness. So I'm writing this down instead, hoping someone will believe it, hoping someone will understand the danger we're all in. Because they're not content to stay in the wilderness anymore. They're moving into our cities, our neighborhoods, our lives, wearing the faces of people we trust, people we love, and there's no way to tell the difference until it's too late. Until you notice that your husband blinks too slowly, or your wife's smile stretches too wide, or your child's eyes reflect light like an animal's in the dark. By then, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Sipsey Wilderness of Alabama, deep in the Bankhead National Forest, where the ancient trees grow so thick that daylight barely penetrates their canopy even at noon. I should have listened to Rex. My German Shepherd had been my constant companion for 6 years, ever since I'd adopted him from the shelter after my divorce. Rex had an uncanny ability to sense danger. He'd warned me about gas leaks, aggressive strangers, even a small kitchen fire before the smoke alarm went off. So, when he started whimpering and refusing to leave the truck at the Thompson Creek trailhead, I should have packed up and driven home to Birmingham. Instead, I chalked it up to nerves. It had been months since our last camping trip, and Rex was getting older. At 8 years old, maybe he was just feeling his age. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My job at the steel mill had been grinding me down, and I needed this escape into the wilderness more than I needed to coddle an anxious dog. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, scratching behind his ears. "Just you and me, like always." Rex finally jumped down from the truck bed, but his tail remained low, and his ears were constantly swiveling, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. The parking area was empty except for my Ford F-150, which wasn't unusual for a Thursday in late October. Most people avoided Sipsey this close to winter. The weather could turn nasty without warning, and the wilderness was unforgiving to the unprepared. I shouldered my pack, heavy with 3 days' worth of supplies, and checked my GPS one last time. The device showed a clear signal and a detailed map of the area. I'd planned a simple loop hike to a backcountry campsite near B Branch, about 5 miles in. Far enough to leave civilization behind, close enough to get out if the weather turned bad. The trail started innocuously enough, winding through a mixed forest of oak, hickory, and pine. Fall had painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, and the forest floor crackled pleasantly under our boots. Rex stayed close to my left heel, closer than usual, but I attributed it to the new environment. Birds called from the canopy above, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker hammered against dead bark. For the first hour, everything seemed perfect. The stress of work began to melt away as we climbed gradually through the rolling hills. The air smelled of decomposing leaves and pine sap, with an underlying earthiness that spoke of rich soil and clean water. This was why I loved the wilderness. It stripped away all the complications of modern life and reduced existence to its essential elements: shelter, food, water, fire. Rex began to relax too, his tail coming up and his gait becoming more confident. We stopped at a small creek to drink and rest, and for a moment, watching him lap at the clear water while autumn leaves drifted downstream, I felt a deep contentment I hadn't experienced in months. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. There were no insects. I'd been hiking for years, and October in Alabama meant bugs. Not the mosquito swarms of summer, but there should have been flies, gnats, maybe some late-season bees. Instead, the forest was oddly sterile, as if something had driven away all the smaller life forms. Rex noticed it too. He lifted his head from the creek, water dripping from his muzzle, and looked around with an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes were wide, showing white around the edges, and his nostrils flared as he scented the air. A low whine escaped his throat, so quiet I almost missed it. "What is it?" "Boy," I whispered, suddenly feeling the need to keep my voice down. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on something across the creek, in the thick undergrowth where the shadows gathered. I followed his stare but saw nothing except trees and fallen logs. Still, the hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I had the distinct impression that we were being watched. "Let's keep moving," I said, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "We've got ground to cover." We crossed the creek on a fallen log and continued up the trail. The path here was less distinct, marked only by occasional blazes on tree trunks and the faint depression of boot prints from previous hikers. According to my map, we should reach the campsite in another 2 hours. The forest began to change as we climbed higher. The trees were older here, their trunks massive and gnarled, their branches reaching across the trail to form a natural tunnel. Very little sunlight made it through the canopy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I zipped up my fleece jacket and checked my watch. 3:30 p.m. We'd have about 3 hours of daylight left once we reached camp. Rex had gone quiet again, his ears constantly moving but his tail low. Every 50 yards or so he would stop and look back the way we'd come, as if checking to make sure we weren't being followed. I began to feel it too, a creeping sensation between my shoulder blades that made me want to turn around. When I finally did look back, the trail behind us was empty. But the feeling didn't go away. The silence was the next thing I noticed. The forest had gone completely quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died. Our footsteps sounded unnaturally loud on the fallen leaves, and our breathing seemed to echo off the trees. It was as if the entire wilderness was holding its breath. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, more to break the silence than because I believed it. But even as I said it, I found myself walking faster, eager to reach the campsite and the illusion of safety that a fire and a tent would provide. The trail began to descend toward B Branch, and I could hear water running somewhere ahead. According to the map, the campsite should be just around the next bend. Rex's behavior was getting worse. He kept turning in circles, sniffing the air and making small, distressed sounds. At one point, he actually tried to turn around and head back down the trail, forcing me to call him firmly to heel. When we finally reached the campsite, I understood why the place felt wrong. The clearing was too perfect. Situated on a small rise above the creek, it was sheltered by massive oaks and had a clear view in all directions. Someone had built a fire ring of carefully arranged stones, and there were level spots that had obviously been used for tents. It should have felt welcoming, but instead, it felt like a trap. Rex refused to enter the clearing. He planted his feet at the tree line and wouldn't move, even when I tried to coax him with treats. His hackles were raised and he was growling deep in his throat. Not at me, but at something I couldn't see. "Fine," I said, my patience finally wearing thin. "We'll camp here at the edge. Happy now?" I set up my tent just inside the tree line, close enough to the clearing to benefit from the open space but far enough away to appease Rex. As I worked, I kept expecting to find some obvious reason for his behavior. A bear marking, a dead animal, anything that would explain his fear. But the area seemed clean and normal, if you ignored the absolute silence and the way the shadows seemed deeper than they should be. By the time I had camp set up, the sun was getting low. I gathered firewood from the surrounding area, noting that there was plenty of deadfall but trying not to think about why no other animals seemed to be using it. Rex followed me as I collected wood, staying so close he was almost tripping me, but he wouldn't help by ranging out to sniff around like he usually did. I got the fire started just as the last light was fading from the sky. The flames provided welcome warmth and light, pushing back the darkness that seemed eager to press in around us. I opened a can of beef stew for dinner and shared it with Rex, but he barely touched his portion. Instead, he sat facing outward from the fire, alert and tense. "You're really freaking me out here, buddy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "What's got you so spooked?" As if in answer to my question, something howled in the distance. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. Alabama didn't have wolves anyway. This was something else, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The sound was long and mournful, but there was an intelligence behind it that spoke of something far more dangerous than any wild animal. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once, and when it finally faded, the silence that followed was even more oppressive than before. Rex was trembling against my leg, something I'd never seen him do. His eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the fire's reach, and I could feel the tension in his muscles. He was ready to run or fight, but he didn't know which. I checked my phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen showed no bars. That wasn't unusual in the wilderness, but somehow it felt ominous. I tried my GPS device and found that it was having trouble maintaining a satellite lock. The screen kept flickering between clear maps and static, as if something was interfering with the signal. "It's okay," I said, as much to convince myself as Rex. "Just atmospheric interference. Maybe a storm coming in." But the sky was clear and the air was still. I threw more wood on the fire and tried to settle in for the night. I'd brought a book, but found I couldn't concentrate on the words. Every few minutes, I'd look up to scan the darkness, expecting to see eyes reflecting the firelight. Rex hadn't relaxed at all. If anything, he seemed to be getting more agitated as the night wore on. Around 9 o'clock, I heard them. Footsteps. They were faint at first, just the softest crunch of leaves somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle our camp at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line, but saw nothing except black trunks and deeper shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Rex was standing now, his hackles so raised he looked twice his normal size. A continuous low growl rumbled from his chest and his lips were pulled back to show his teeth. I'd never seen him look so aggressive or so terrified at the same time. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours. I kept the fire built up high, feeding it constantly to maintain a wide circle of light. Every time the flames died down, the darkness seemed to press closer, and I had the distinct impression that something was waiting just beyond the edge of visibility. Around midnight, exhaustion finally began to win over fear. Rex had settled slightly, though he remained alert, and nothing had happened for over an hour. I banked the fire and retreated to my tent, leaving the rain fly open so I could see out. Rex curled up in the entrance, blocking any attempt to get to me without going through him first. I dozed fitfully, waking every time the wind rustled the leaves or a branch creaked. Each time I woke, Rex was still alert, still watching the darkness. Sometime around 3 a.m., I fell into a deeper sleep, exhausted by the constant vigilance. I woke to silence. Not the oppressive quiet of the night before, but a different kind of silence. A missing piece that took me a moment to identify. Rex wasn't breathing. I bolted upright, my heart hammering, and looked toward the tent entrance where he'd been sleeping. The space was empty. No dog, no sign that he'd ever been there except for a slight depression in the sleeping bag where he'd been lying. "Rex," I called, crawling out of the tent. "Rex, come here, boy." The fire had burned down to cold ashes, which was impossible. I'd banked it properly, and it should have had coals for hours. My watch showed 6:15 a.m., but the forest was still dark, as if the sun was reluctant to rise. I grabbed my flashlight and began searching the area around camp, calling Rex's name. There were no paw prints in the soft earth, no sign of a struggle, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. It was as if he'd simply vanished. Panic began to set in. Rex had never run off before, not once in 6 years. Even when spooked, he'd always stayed close to me. For him to disappear without a sound, without a trace, meant something was seriously wrong. I spent the next hour searching in expanding circles around the campsite, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. The forest remained stubbornly silent, offering no clues. As the sky finally began to lighten, I made the decision to pack up and hike out. Without Rex, staying in the wilderness seemed like suicide. I was rolling up my sleeping bag when I heard it, a bark from somewhere downstream along the creek. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that my knees almost buckled. "Rex," I shouted, "stay there, boy, I'm coming." I left everything at the campsite and crashed through the underbrush toward the sound. The barking continued, seeming to come from a thick stand of rhododendron about a quarter-mile away. As I got closer, I could hear something else, a whimpering sound that made my heart clench. I found him lying in a small clearing, his fur matted with blood. "Oh God, Rex, what happened to you?" I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him and cause more pain. There were scratches along his flanks, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, and his left ear was torn. But he was alive, and when he saw me, his tail managed a weak wag. I examined him as carefully as I could, checking for broken bones or internal injuries. The wounds were bad, but didn't seem life-threatening, and he was able to stand when I helped him up. Whatever had attacked him had done it as a warning, not trying to kill. "Come on, buddy," I said, supporting his weight as we made our way back to camp. "Let's get you cleaned up and get out of here." But when we reached the campsite, everything had changed. My tent was shredded, long tears in the fabric that looked like they'd been made by claws. My sleeping bag was scattered in pieces around the clearing, the stuffing floating in the morning air like snow. My backpack was torn open, and my supplies were strewn everywhere, some missing, others destroyed. But the most disturbing thing was the fire ring. The stones had been arranged in a different pattern, forming a rough circle with strange symbols scratched into their surfaces. In the center, where the ashes should have been, was a pile of small bones. They looked like they might have come from rabbits or squirrels, picked clean and arranged with deliberate care. Rex began to whimper, pressing against my legs. His behavior had changed completely. Gone was the confident, protective dog I'd known for years. This Rex was submissive, almost cringing, as if he'd been broken by whatever had happened to him during the night. I gathered what was left of my supplies, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my damaged pack. The woods around us had come alive with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the normal sounds of a forest morning. But it felt wrong, artificial, like a recording being played to mask something else. We started back down the trail, Rex limping beside me. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following us, but the path behind remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, pushed along a route that something else had chosen. The hike that had taken us 4 hours yesterday should have taken 3 on the way out, all downhill. But something was wrong with the trail. Paths that should have led back to the parking area instead curved deeper into the wilderness. Blazes on trees pointed in directions that made no sense according to my compass. My GPS device was completely dead, not just out of signal but actually broken, its screen cracked despite being in my pack all night. By noon, we should have been back at the truck, Instead, we were lost in a part of the forest I didn't recognize, following what might have been a game trail through increasingly thick underbrush. Rex had stopped limping, but his behavior was becoming more and more strange. He walked with his head down, never meeting my eyes, and when I spoke to him, he didn't respond the way he used to. "Rex, come here," I called when he started to wander off the trail. He turned toward me, but there was a delay, as if he had to think about the command before obeying. When he got close enough, I saw that his eyes had changed color. What had been warm brown was now a pale, almost colorless gray. What the hell? I reached out to touch his head, and he flinched away from me for the first time in his life. That was when I heard the laughter. It came from somewhere ahead of us on the trail, high-pitched and definitely not human. It echoed through the trees, seeming to bounce off the trunks and multiply until it sounded like a whole crowd of things were laughing at some private joke. Rex's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He dropped into a crouch, his lips pulled back in a snarl that showed every tooth. But he wasn't snarling at the source of the laughter. He was snarling at me. "Rex." I backed away slowly, my hand moving instinctively toward the hunting knife on my belt. "What's wrong, boy?" The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had started, and in the silence that followed, Rex straightened up. When he looked at me again, his expression was completely neutral, as if nothing had happened. But I knew. Whatever had come back from the woods that morning, it wasn't really my dog. I started running. Behind me, I heard Rex, or the thing wearing Rex's body, begin to follow. His footsteps were wrong. The rhythm off, as if something that didn't quite understand how dogs moved was trying to mimic the gait. When I glanced back, I saw him loping along on two legs like a person, his front paws barely touching the ground. The sight was so wrong, so fundamentally disturbing that I stumbled and nearly fell. I caught myself against a tree and kept running, crashing through underbrush that tore at my clothes and pack. The forest around me began to change as I ran. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching across the trail to form a canopy so thick that barely any light filtered through. The air grew cold and stagnant, smelling of rot and something else, something like burnt meat. I could hear Rex behind me, but he wasn't panting like a dog should after a long run. Instead, there was a sound like wheezing laughter, as if whatever was controlling him found my terror amusing. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine I'd never seen on any map. Water ran somewhere far below, but I couldn't see the bottom through the mist that rose from the depths. To my left and right, the ravine stretched as far as I could see, an impassable barrier that shouldn't have existed. I turned around to face whatever was wearing my dog's skin. Rex stood about 20 feet away, perfectly still. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his gray eyes held an intelligence that was definitely not canine. When he opened his mouth, human words came out in a voice like grinding stones. "Michael Williams," it said, pronouncing each syllable with careful precision. 34 years old, lives alone in Birmingham, works at the steel mill, divorced, no children. "What are you?" I whispered. Rex's mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile if dogs could smile. "I am hunger. I am the cold between the stars. I am what waits in the places where maps end." "Where's my dog?" "Your dog is here," it said. And for just a moment, I saw a flicker of the real Rex in those pale eyes. Terrified, screaming without a voice, trapped inside his own body while something else pulled the strings. He wants you to run. He wants you to fight. He knows what's coming. The thing wearing Rex's body began to change. Its limbs stretched and twisted, bones cracking audibly as they extended beyond any normal proportion. Its fur fell away in patches, revealing skin that was gray and mottled like a corpse. Its face elongated into something between human and wolf, with too many teeth and eyes that had gone completely black. But it was still wearing Rex's collar. "I've been so hungry," it whispered, "and you have led me such a fine chase." I pulled out my hunting knife, knowing it was useless but needing to feel some kind of weapon in my hand. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and took a step forward. That's when the real Rex fought back. For just a second, the thing's control slipped. Rex's consciousness surged to the surface and his transformed body stumbled as two different wills fought for control. Its face contorted in pain, and a sound came out that was part howl, part human scream. I didn't waste the opportunity. I ran straight at the creature, diving past it toward the tree line. Behind me, I heard Rex's voice, really his voice, calling my name in a tone of desperate warning. I crashed through the underbrush expecting any second to feel claws tear into my back, but the attack didn't come. Instead, I heard the sound of a tremendous struggle, growling, snapping, the crack of breaking bones. Rex was fighting the thing that had possessed him, buying me time with the last of his strength. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing against a massive oak tree. When I looked back, I could see nothing but forest. The sounds of struggle had stopped, and the woods were quiet again. I never saw Rex again. It took me 2 more days to find my way out of the wilderness. I followed water downhill until I reached a creek, then followed the creek until it joined a larger stream, then followed that until I reached a dirt road. A farmer found me walking along Highway 33, dehydrated and half-mad with exhaustion. I told the ranger who interviewed me that my dog had been attacked by a bear and had run off. I said I'd gotten lost trying to find him. They found my truck at the Thompson Creek trailhead, and they sent search teams into the wilderness to look for Rex's body. They never found anything. But sometimes, on clear nights when the wind is right, I can hear him howling. Not the thing that wore his body, but Rex himself, still fighting, still trying to warn people away from the deep woods where ancient hungers wait for the unwary. I live in the city now, in a high-rise apartment with locks on every door and windows that face busy streets. I tell myself that what happened in Sipsey Wilderness was a breakdown, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation and fear. But I know better. Because 3 weeks after I came out of the woods, I got a package with no return address. Inside was Rex's collar, still bloody, with a note written in what looked like charcoal. "Thank you for the feast. The dog was delicious, but I am still hungry. I know where you live now." I moved that same day. Last month I heard that 3 hikers had gone missing in the Sipsey Wilderness. The authorities think they got lost in a storm. But I know better. I know what's waiting in those deep woods, wearing familiar faces and speaking with trusted voices. And I know that someday, when my guard is down and I'm not expecting it, I'll hear a bark at my door. I'll look through the peephole and see Rex sitting there, tail wagging, eyes bright with intelligence and love. But it won't be Rex. And God help me, I'm afraid I might open the door anyway, because I miss my dog more than I fear what's wearing his skin. The hunger in the wilderness is patient. It can wait. It knows that grief makes people do stupid things, and it knows I still have his favorite tennis ball. My name is Michael Williams and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Bankhead National Forest in Alabama, deep in the wilderness where the old logging roads peter out into nothing but rotting timber and shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. I should have listened to the locals in Double Springs when they warned us about Dismal's Canyon and the areas beyond it. Should have paid attention when the old man at the gas station looked at our hiking permits and shook his head, muttering something about the hollow and how folks who go there sometimes come back different. But we were city boys from Birmingham, cocky with our expensive gear and GPS devices, thinking we knew better than some backwoods superstition. There were 4 of us, me, Jake Morrison, my best friend since college, Dylan Carter, Jake's co-worker from the engineering firm, and Brandon Edwards, Dylan's younger brother who'd just graduated from Auburn. We'd been planning this 3-day backpacking trip for months, wanting to get away from our cubicles and reconnect with something primal. The irony of that desire still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The plan was simple. Park at the Sipsey River trailhead, hike 12 miles into the backcountry to a remote area called Branch Hollow, set up camp, and spend 2 nights under the stars before hiking back out. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, no rain expected. Our packs were loaded with enough supplies for a week, though we only planned to be gone 3 days. Jake, always the cautious one, insisted on the extra provisions. "Better to carry too much than too little," he'd said, adjusting the straps on his pack in the parking lot. Jake was methodical like that, the kind of guy who made spreadsheets for vacation planning. At 6'2" with sandy brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he looked more like a librarian than an outdoorsman. But he'd been hiking since he was a kid with his father. Dylan was the opposite. Impulsive, always ready for an adventure. Dark-haired and stocky, with arms covered in tattoos from his army days, he'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home and settling into civilian life. He never talked much about his service, but sometimes I'd catch him staring off into the distance with an expression I couldn't read. Brandon, at 22, was the baby of the group, tall and lean like a basketball player, with an easy smile and boundless energy. He'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, constantly texting our group chat with links to YouTube videos about wilderness survival and campfire cooking. His enthusiasm was infectious. As for me, I was somewhere in the middle, not as cautious as Jake, not as reckless as Dylan, but drawn to the outdoors by something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the silence, the way the modern world seemed to fall away when you got far enough from civilization. Maybe it was the challenge of testing yourself against something real and unforgiving. Or maybe it was just the simple pleasure of sitting around a fire with friends, sharing stories and watching the stars emerge one by one. We started hiking at dawn, our boots crunching on frost-covered leaves as we followed the Sipsey River Trail deeper into the forest. The morning was crisp and clear, with golden sunlight filtering through the canopy of oak and hickory trees. Our breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and I felt that familiar surge of excitement that comes with the beginning of an adventure. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. We made good time on the established trails, pausing occasionally to check our map and GPS coordinates. The conversation flowed easily, Dylan telling stories about his coworkers, Brandon planning his post-graduation job search, Jake analyzing the geological formations we passed. I felt that comfortable camaraderie that comes from years of friendship, the easy rhythm of men who've known each other long enough to fill in each other's sentences. Around midday, we reached the point where we needed to leave the main trail and bushwhack into the backcountry. According to our research, Branch Hollow was accessible via an old logging road that had been abandoned decades ago. The road wasn't on any current maps, but we'd found references to it in some historical forestry documents Jake had dug up online. "Should be right around here," Jake said, consulting his GPS device and the photocopied maps he'd laminated. According to the 1960s survey, the logging road starts about 50 yards upstream from this creek junction. We spent 20 minutes searching through thick underbrush before Dylan called out from behind a tangle of fallen trees. Found it, or what's left of it anyway. What he'd discovered was barely recognizable as a road, more like a depression in the forest floor, marked by the occasional rotting stump and the straight-line spacing of mature trees that indicated human intervention decades ago. Thick briars and fallen logs blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing us to detour through the surrounding woods. The atmosphere began to change as we followed the old road deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller and more densely packed, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. The air became cooler and heavier, thick with the smell of decomposing leaves and something else, something faintly sweet and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "Place gives me the creeps," Brandon muttered, swatting at a cloud of gnats that had materialized around his head. "Feels like we're being watched." Dylan laughed, but it sounded forced. "Just your imagination, kid. Nothing out here but trees and squirrels." But I knew what Brandon meant. There was something oppressive about the silence in this part of the forest. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound, and there was that smell, growing stronger as we went deeper, sweet and sickly, like overripe fruit. We'd been hiking for about 6 hours when Jake's GPS device started acting up. The screen flickered between different coordinate readings, never settling on a consistent location. He stopped to check his phone, but there was no signal this deep in the forest. "Technology," Dylan said with a dismissive wave. "This is why I prefer a compass and map." Jake pulled out his backup compass, but it spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "That's weird. Must be some kind of mineral deposit interfering with the magnetic field." "Or we're in a dead zone," I suggested, though the words sounded hollow even to me. I'd never heard of a dead zone that affected both GPS and compass readings. We pressed on, following the barely visible logging road as it wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were ancient, massive oaks and hickories that must have been saplings when the road was first cut. Their branches interlaced overhead, creating a living tunnel that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. It was Brandon who first noticed the markings on the trees. "Hey, check this out," he called, pointing to a large oak about 20 feet off the path. Carved into the bark were symbols I didn't recognize, angular shapes that looked almost like letters but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. The cuts were old but still visible, scarred over with new bark growth. "Probably old surveyor marks," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. He walked over to examine the symbols more closely, running his fingers along the carved lines. "Though I've never seen marks like these before." We found more symbols as we continued, carved into trees at irregular intervals. Some were simple geometric shapes, triangles, circles, intersecting lines. Others were more complex, resembling crude pictographs of animals or human figures. They all had the same aged appearance, as if they'd been there for decades. "Local kids, probably," Dylan suggested. "Rural teenagers with too much time on their hands." But something about the symbols felt older than that, more deliberate. They weren't random graffiti but seemed to follow some kind of pattern, marking our route deeper into the forest like breadcrumbs leading us towards something we couldn't see. The light was beginning to fade when we finally reached Bee Branch Hollow. The logging road ended abruptly at the edge of a natural clearing, a bowl-shaped depression about 50 yards across, surrounded by towering trees. A small creek, presumably Bee Branch, meandered through the middle of the hollow, its water dark and still in the fading light. "This is it," Jake announced, consulting his laminated maps. "Bee Branch Hollow, base camp for the next 2 nights." The clearing should have been perfect for camping. It was level and relatively dry, with easy access to water and plenty of dead wood for a fire, but something about the place felt wrong. The silence was even more oppressive here, broken only by the gentle gurgle of the creek. The air was thick and humid despite the cool temperature, and that sweet, cloying smell was stronger than ever. "Anyone else smell that?" Brandon asked, wrinkling his nose. "Smells like something died." Dylan was already exploring the perimeter of the clearing, looking for the best spot to set up our tents. "Probably just decomposing vegetation. Natural forest smell." But it wasn't natural. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between the clean smell of decomposing leaves and this sickly sweet odor that seemed to cling to the inside of my nostrils. We set up camp in the center of the clearing, arranging our 4 tents in a rough circle around where we planned to build our fire. Jake, ever organized, had brought a portable camp stove, but Dylan insisted on gathering wood for a traditional campfire. "Part of the experience," he said, shouldering his small hatchet. "Sitting around a real fire, telling stories, roasting marshmallows. You can't do that with a camp stove." As Dylan headed into the tree line to gather firewood, Brandon began filtering water from the creek using his portable purification system. The water looked clean enough, but it had an odd taste, slightly metallic, with that same faint sweetness that permeated the air. Jake was busy with his camera, documenting our campsite and the surrounding forest. Photography was his hobby, and he'd brought an expensive digital SLR with multiple lenses. He'd been taking pictures throughout the hike, capturing the changing landscape as we moved deeper into the wilderness. "Light's getting interesting," he said, adjusting his camera settings. "Golden hour in the forest. Should get some great shots." I was organizing our shared supplies, food, cooking equipment, first aid kit, when I heard Dylan calling from the woods. "Hey, Mike, come give me a hand with this." I found him about 30 yards from the clearing, standing next to a massive fallen tree. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, ancient and hollow with rot. Dylan had already cut several branches from the deadfall, but he needed help carrying the larger pieces back to camp. "Good wood," he said, running his hand along the bark. "Been dead for years, but still solid. Should burn clean." As we loaded our arms with firewood, I noticed more of the strange symbols carved into nearby trees. These were different from the ones we'd seen along the trail, more complex, with intricate geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shimmer in my peripheral vision, as if the lines were moving. "Dylan, look at these markings." He glanced over, then shrugged. "Yeah, I saw them. Weird, right? But we've got enough mysteries for one day. Let's get this wood back to camp before it gets dark." By the time we returned to the clearing, the sun had disappeared behind the tree line, leaving us in deep shadow. Brandon had finished filtering water and was helping Jake set up his tent. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I was grateful for the warmth we'd have once we got the fire going. Dylan arranged the wood in a careful pattern: tinder, kindling, then larger pieces in a teepee shape. He'd been a Boy Scout as a kid and took pride in his fire-building skills. But when he struck his lighter, something strange happened. The flame wouldn't catch. "Damp wood," he muttered, trying again. The lighter produced a steady flame, but the tinder, dry leaves and paper that should have caught immediately, just smoldered and died. "Let me try," Brandon offered, pulling out his own lighter. Same result. The flame burned cleanly, but nothing would catch fire. Jake produced a small bottle of lighter fluid and soaked the tinder. When Dylan applied the flame this time, it caught with a whoosh, but the fire was wrong. Instead of the warm orange glow of a normal campfire, the flames burned with an unsettling blue-green tinge, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed around the clearing. "Mineral content in the wood," Jake suggested, but his voice was uncertain. "Copper deposits, maybe. That would explain the color." The fire provided warmth, but little comfort. The strange-colored flames seemed to move independently of the wind, reaching toward us with finger-like projections before retreating back into the main body of the fire. And the shadows it cast were all wrong. Too long, too sharp, moving in ways that didn't match the movement of the flames. We tried to ignore the weirdness and stick to our planned routine. Brandon unpacked his camp cooking gear and started heating a pot of chili, while Jake continued taking pictures with his camera. Dylan sharpened his knife, a ritual he performed every evening when camping. I pulled out the deck of cards I'd brought, hoping a familiar game would help normalize the situation. But normal was the last thing we could achieve in that place. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during dinner. We were sitting around the fire eating chili and cornbread when Jake's camera started acting up. The LCD screen flickered between different images, some showing the forest around us, others displaying pictures that Jake hadn't taken. Dark, blurry images of twisted trees and strange shapes moving between them. "Battery must be dying," Jake said, but when he checked, the battery indicator showed a full charge. Brandon's headlamp started strobing on and off randomly, and my watch, a reliable timepiece I'd owned for 5 years, began running backward. We were all tech-savvy enough to know that electronic devices could malfunction, but having multiple devices fail simultaneously was unsettling. "Electromagnetic interference," Dylan suggested. "Maybe we're near some kind of geological anomaly. Unusual mineral deposits, underground caves, that sort of thing." It was a rational explanation, and we all wanted to believe it. But rationality felt fragile in that place, overwhelmed by the growing sense that we were somewhere we didn't belong. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness settled over the forest. The fire provided a small circle of warmth and light, but beyond its glow lay impenetrable blackness. No stars were visible through the canopy, and even the moon seemed dimmed, as if the forest itself was absorbing light. We'd planned to spend the evening telling stories and enjoying the solitude, but conversation came in fits and starts. Every sound from the surrounding woods, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made us freeze and listen. The silence between sounds was worse than the sounds themselves, heavy with the weight of unseen presence. Around 10 o'clock, Brandon announced he was ready for bed. "Long day tomorrow," he said, yawning. "Want to get an early start if we're going to explore the area." One by one, we retired to our tents, leaving the fire to burn down to coals. My tent was positioned facing the creek, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, I could hear the gentle movement of water over stones. It should have been soothing, but something about the sound bothered me. The rhythm was too regular, too mechanical, like water flowing through artificial channels rather than a natural stream bed. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was being awakened by screaming. Brandon's voice, high and terrified, piercing the night air. "Help! Something's got me! Help!" I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped my tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fire had died down to barely glowing embers, providing almost no light. Brandon's tent was maybe 20 feet away, but in the darkness it might as well have been miles. "Brandon," I called out, "where are you?" Jake's voice came from somewhere to my left. "I can't find my flashlight. It was right here." Dylan was shouting too, his military training evident in the sharp command tone. "Sound off! Everyone sound off!" "Mike here," I called. "Jake!" Silence where Brandon's voice should have been. I fumbled around my tent until I found my headlamp, but when I pressed the switch, nothing happened. Dead battery, though it had been fully charged when we'd made camp. My backup flashlight was equally useless. "Anyone got a working light?" Dylan called. "Negative," Jake replied. "Everything's dead." In the distance, maybe 100 yards away, we heard Brandon calling again. "Help me! I can't move! Something's wrong with my legs!" His voice was coming from the direction of the creek beyond the far edge of the clearing. How had he gotten so far from his tent? And why hadn't we heard him leave? "Stay together," Dylan ordered. "We find some light source, then we go get him. Nobody goes alone." Jake managed to coax a small flame from the dying campfire, enough to light a torch made from one of our remaining branches. The improvised light cast a weak orange glow that barely penetrated the darkness, but it was better than nothing. "Brandon," I called as we made our way toward the sound of his voice. "Keep calling, we're coming." But his voice had fallen silent. We reached the edge of the clearing and found Brandon's tent still zipped shut, his sleeping bag empty but warm, as if he'd just left it. His boots were still inside the tent, along with his jacket and flashlight. Whatever had taken him? He'd left barefoot and wearing only his underwear and t-shirt. "His prints," Dylan said, crouching down with the torch. In the soft earth near the creek, we could see footprints leading away from the campsite, but they were wrong. Brandon wore size 11 boots, but these prints were larger, with an odd shape that didn't look quite human. The stride length was impossible too, covering ground in 8-foot steps. Jake was examining the prints more closely when the torch suddenly guttered out, plunging us back into absolute darkness. "Light it again," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "I'm trying." Jake's voice was strained. "It won't catch." We heard movement in the darkness ahead of us toward the creek. Not footsteps, but something heavier, like a large animal moving through the underbrush. Then Brandon's voice again, but different this time. Calmer, almost monotone. "I'm fine," he called. "I'm coming back. Everything's fine." Relief flooded through me. Maybe he'd just been sleepwalking, disoriented by the strange environment. Maybe he'd fallen and hurt himself, then managed to get free. There had to be a rational explanation. But Dylan grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "That's not Brandon," he whispered. "What do you mean?" "Listen to his voice. That's not how he talks." And he was right. Brandon was usually animated, expressive, his speech patterns quick and enthusiastic. This voice was flat, emotionless, with none of his characteristic inflections. "I'm coming back to camp," the Brandon voice continued. "Don't come looking for me. Stay by the fire." We heard movement approaching through the darkness, branches breaking under heavy footsteps. But the gait was wrong. Too regular, too measured, like someone walking to a metronome. "Brandon," I called tentatively. "Is that you?" "Yes." The voice was closer now, maybe 50 feet away. "It's me. Brandon, I'm fine." Jake managed to get another branch lit, and in the flickering light we saw a figure approaching through the trees. It was Brandon, or something that looked like Brandon. Same height, same build, same sandy blonde hair, but something was off about the way he moved. Too fluid and controlled, like a marionette being operated by someone who'd studied human locomotion but never quite mastered it. And his eyes. Even in the dim torchlight, I could see that his eyes were wrong. Too bright, too reflective, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. "Where were you?" Dylan demanded, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. "We heard you screaming." "Sleepwalking," Brandon replied in that same flat tone. "I went to the creek. I'm fine now." He walked past us toward the camp, his movements still unnaturally smooth. Jake held the torch higher, trying to get a better look at him, and that's when I saw the scratches. 3 parallel gashes ran down Brandon's left arm from shoulder to elbow, deep enough to draw blood. His t-shirt was torn, and there were similar scratches on his chest and neck, but he showed no sign of pain, no acknowledgement that he was injured. "Jesus. Brandon, you're hurt," I said, moving toward him. "What happened?" He turned to look at me, and I stopped dead. His face was Brandon's face, but the expression was all wrong. No emotion, no recognition, just a blank stare that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "I fell," he said. "I'm fine." We followed him back to the campsite, Dylan keeping his hand on his knife, Jake holding the torch high. Brandon went directly to his tent and crawled inside without another word. "That's not Brandon," Dylan whispered when we were back at the fire ring. "I don't know what the hell that is, but it's not him." Jake was shaking, holding the torch with trembling hands. "Maybe he hit his head when he fell. Concussion can cause personality changes, disorientation." "Did you see those scratches?" I asked. "Those weren't from a fall. Something attacked him." "Then where is it?" Dylan demanded. "Whatever did that to him, where did it go?" We had no answers. We rebuilt the fire, this time using lighter fluid liberally to ensure it would stay lit. The flames still burned with that unsettling blue-green tinge, but they provided light and the illusion of security. None of us slept that night. We took turns keeping watch, feeding the fire, listening to the sounds from Brandon's tent. Every hour or so, we'd hear movement, the rustle of his sleeping bag, the sound of him shifting position. But he never spoke, never responded when we called his name. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the heavy canopy. In the gray morning light, everything looked different, less threatening, more normal. Brandon emerged from his tent at sunrise, moving with his usual energy and enthusiasm. "Morning, guys," he called cheerfully. "Beautiful day for hiking." The scratches were gone. No marks on his arms, no torn shirt, no sign of the injuries we'd all seen the night before. He seemed completely normal, the real Brandon, not the strange, emotionless figure that had returned to camp in the darkness. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked carefully. "Great, best sleep I've had in weeks. Why?" We exchanged glances. Either Brandon had no memory of the night's events, or whatever had happened was so traumatic that his mind had blocked it out. Or, and this was the possibility that made my stomach churn, the thing that had come back to camp wasn't Brandon at all, and the real Brandon was still out there somewhere. You were sleepwalking, Dylan said, studying Brandon's face for any reaction. You wandered off toward the creek. Don't you remember? Brandon frowned, looking genuinely confused. I don't remember anything after going to bed. Weird. I've never sleepwalked before. He began making breakfast with his usual enthusiasm, chattering about the hike planned for the day and the wildlife he hoped to see. But I caught Dylan watching him intently, looking for tells, for some sign that this wasn't really our friend. Over coffee and instant oatmeal, we debated our options. We could pack up and hike out, chalking the whole experience up to first-night jitters in an unfamiliar environment. We could stay and pretend nothing had happened, hoping it had been an isolated incident. Or we could confront Brandon directly, demand to know what had really happened the night before. I say we stay, Brandon said when we explained our concerns. Come on, guys, so I sleepwalked. So the electronics are acting up. That's no reason to abandon the whole trip. Jake was torn. The photographer in him wanted to document this strange place, but the rational part of his mind was screaming warnings. Maybe we should at least move to a different campsite. This place has bad mojo. Bad mojo? Dylan laughed, but it sounded forced. Since when do you believe in mojo? In the end, we decided to stay but remain vigilant. We'd planned a day hike to explore the surrounding area, and Brandon was insistent that we stick to the schedule. We came here for an adventure, he said. Let's not let a little weirdness scare us off. So we packed day packs with water and snacks and set off to explore Bee Branch Hollow. In the daylight, the forest seemed less threatening. We found the source of the creek, a natural spring that bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks. We discovered an old foundation, probably from a cabin built by the loggers decades ago. Jake took dozens of pictures, documenting the indigenous plants and geological formations. But the symbols were everywhere, carved into trees, scratched into rocks, even formed from arranged stones on the forest floor. They were clearly old, weathered by years of exposure. But there were fresh ones too, symbols that looked like they'd been made recently, cut into tree bark with a sharp knife. Local teenagers, Dylan insisted when I pointed them out. Gang tags, probably. But these weren't gang tags. They were too systematic, too deliberate, and some of them were carved 20 feet up in trees, far higher than any human could reach without climbing equipment. We found other things too. Animal bones arranged in geometric patterns, trees that had been twisted into impossible shapes, their trunks spiraling like corkscrews, areas where the forest floor was completely bare of vegetation, forming perfect circles 30 feet across. Natural phenomena, Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Soil chemistry, disease, that sort of thing. By late afternoon, we'd covered maybe 5 miles in a rough circle around our base camp. The forest seemed to go on forever in every direction, an endless maze of trees and shadows. According to our map, we should have intersected with some of the main trails by now, but we'd seen no sign of them. GPS is still acting up, Jake reported, checking his device for the 100th time. Shows us in 3 different locations simultaneously. Compass is still spinning, Dylan added. Whatever's screwing with the magnetic field, it's getting stronger. We were making our way back toward camp when Brandon suddenly stopped. Do you hear that? I listened but heard only the usual forest sounds, wind in the trees, the distant gurgle of the creek, the occasional bird call. Hear what? I asked. Singing, Brandon said. Someone singing? Dylan and Jake exchanged glances. Neither of them heard it either. What kind of singing? Dylan asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his knife. Children's voices, Brandon replied, tilting his head as if trying to locate the source. Nursery rhymes, I think. Very faint. We stood in silence for several minutes, straining to hear what Brandon was hearing. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest and our own increasingly ragged breathing. Maybe it's echoing from somewhere else, Jake suggested. Sound can carry long distances in the right conditions. But we were miles from any human habitation, deep in a wilderness area where children had no business being, and Brandon's behavior was increasingly concerning. He kept stopping to listen to sounds the rest of us couldn't hear, turning his head toward empty spaces as if watching something move through the trees. We reached camp just as the sun was setting, and I felt a profound relief to see our tents still standing, our equipment undisturbed. The fire ring held cold ashes from the night before, but Dylan quickly rebuilt the fire, this time using almost half our remaining lighter fluid to ensure it would catch. The flames burned with the same eerie blue-green color, casting those wrong shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire itself. But it was light and warmth, and in this place, those things felt precious beyond measure. Brandon was quiet during dinner, picking at his food and staring off into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. When Jake asked him about the singing he'd heard, Brandon looked confused, as if he didn't remember mentioning it. "Singing? I don't know what you're talking about." "This afternoon," I prompted. "On the hike back. You said you heard children singing." Brandon frowned, genuinely puzzled. "I think I'd remember something like that. Are you sure it wasn't one of you guys?" It was disturbing how completely he'd forgotten the incident. Memory lapses could be a sign of head trauma, but Brandon showed no other symptoms of concussion. He was alert, responsive, physically coordinated. It was as if his memory was being selectively edited, certain experiences deleted while others remained intact. As night fell, we made preparations for another sleepless vigil. Dylan volunteered for first watch, sitting with his back to a large tree and his knife within easy reach. Jake set up his camera on a tripod, hoping to capture any unusual activity. I arranged my sleeping bag so I could see most of the campsite while appearing to be asleep. Brandon went to bed early, crawling into his tent with a cheery, "Good night, guys," that sounded forced in the oppressive atmosphere of the hollow. The first few hours passed quietly. Dylan fed the fire regularly. Jake took long exposure photographs of the star-shrouded canopy, and I dozed fitfully in my sleeping bag. But around midnight, things began to go wrong again. It started with the fire. Despite Dylan's constant attention, the flames began to dwindle, growing smaller and dimmer until they provided barely enough light to see across the clearing. Dylan added more wood, even poured on the last of our lighter fluid, but the fire continued to die. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "This should be blazing." Jake's camera was malfunctioning again, the LCD screen showing those same strange images, dark shapes moving between trees, symbols that seemed to shift and change when you looked at them directly. But now there were new images too, pictures of our campsite taken from impossible angles, as if someone was photographing us from 30 feet up in the air. And we began to hear sounds from the forest around us. Not the usual night sounds, but something else. Rhythmic percussion, like drumbeats or footsteps, coming from multiple directions. The sounds would start, continue for a few minutes, then stop abruptly, only to resume from a different location. "We're surrounded," Dylan whispered, his hand tight on his knife handle. But by what? And why hadn't whatever was out there simply attacked us? It felt like we were being studied, observed, evaluated by intelligences that remained just beyond our understanding. The sounds grew louder and more complex. Not just percussion now, but something that might have been voices, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, rising and falling in waves that seemed to resonate in my chest. And then Brandon's tent began to glow. A soft, phosphorescent light emanated from inside the nylon walls, pulsing in time with the chanting. Through the thin fabric, we could see Brandon's silhouette, but he was moving in ways that didn't look human. Fluid, serpentine motions that no human spine could achieve. "Brandon," Jake called softly. "Are you okay?" The glowing stopped instantly, and the forest fell silent. Brandon's voice came from inside the tent, cheerful and normal. "Fine, just rearranging my gear." But we'd all seen the impossible movements, the way his silhouette had twisted and contorted inside the tent. Whatever was in there, it wasn't entirely human anymore. Dylan made a decision. Moving slowly and quietly, he crept toward Brandon's tent, knife in hand. He positioned himself near the zippered entrance, listening for movement inside. "Brandon," he called softly. "Come out here. We need to talk." "In a minute," came the reply. "Just getting comfortable." Dylan waited, counting seconds. When Brandon didn't emerge, he reached for the zipper and pulled it down in one quick motion. The tent was empty. Not just empty, completely empty. No sleeping bag, no gear, no sign that anyone had ever been inside. But we'd all heard Brandon's voice coming from within, had seen his silhouette moving against the tent walls. "Where is he?" Jake whispered, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. We searched the campsite, calling Brandon's name in urgent whispers. His boots were still by his tent, his jacket still hanging from a tree branch. But Brandon himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The chanting resumed, louder now, coming from all around us. The percussion built to a crescendo, and suddenly the forest erupted with movement. Dark shapes flitted between the trees, too quick and fluid to be human. Red eyes gleamed in the darkness beyond our dying fire. And from somewhere in the darkness came Brandon's voice, but wrong again, distorted, as if it was being transmitted through water or static. "Help me, help me. They're changing me." Dylan grabbed a burning branch from the fire, waving it like a torch. "Show yourselves," he shouted. "What do you want?" The chanting stopped abruptly and the forest fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was our own ragged breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. Then we heard footsteps, human footsteps, approaching from the direction of the creek. Regular, measured, familiar. Brandon emerged from the darkness, walking with that same unnaturally smooth gait we'd seen the night before. In the flickering firelight, he looked normal. Same clothes, same face, same build. But his eyes reflected the light like mirrors, and when he smiled, I saw that his teeth were wrong. Too many of them, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark's. "I'm back," he said in that flat, emotionless voice. "I told you I'd be back." Dylan raised his knife, stepping between Brandon Thing and the rest of us. "You're not Brandon. What are you? What did you do with our friend?" The thing that looked like Brandon tilted its head, studying Dylan with those reflecting eyes. "I am Brandon. I've always been Brandon, but I'm more now. Better." It took a step closer, and Dylan slashed with his knife. The blade passed through Brandon's arm without resistance, as if he was made of smoke or shadow. But where the knife passed, Brandon's form flickered, revealing something else underneath. Something tall and gaunt, with 2 long limbs and a face that wasn't quite human. "You can join me," the Brandon Thing said, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "All of you. The change is wonderful, freeing. You'll understand once you stop fighting it." More shapes emerged from the darkness, tall, impossibly thin figures that moved with that same fluid grace. Some wore faces I almost recognized, as if they were imperfect copies of people I'd known. Others made no attempt at human disguise, revealing themselves as the alien things they truly were. Jake was frantically packing his camera equipment, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the clasps on his bag. "We need to leave. Now. Right now." But when we turned toward the trail that had brought us to the hollow, the path was gone. Where the old logging road had been, there was only dense forest, trees so tightly packed that we couldn't have forced our way between them. "The road's gone," I said, my voice rising toward panic. "The trail we came in on. It's not there anymore." Dylan spun in a circle, torch held high, confirming what I'd seen. We were trapped in the clearing, surrounded by creatures that wore human faces like masks, and a forest that had rearranged itself to prevent our escape. The Brandon Thing was closer now. Close enough that I could smell it, that same sickly sweet odor that had permeated the hollow since our arrival. Up close, its imitation of humanity was less convincing. The proportions were slightly off, the movements too smooth, the facial expressions never quite matching the words it spoke. "Why fight it?" it asked, reaching toward me with fingers that were too long, jointed in too many places. You came here looking for something real, something primal. This is it. This is what you were looking for. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the dying fire. The flames flared up briefly as Dylan fed them more wood, casting wild shadows that danced and writhed around the clearing. "The symbols," Jake said suddenly. "All those symbols we've been seeing, they're not markings. They're warnings. People trying to warn others away from this place." It made horrible sense. The carved symbols, the strange atmospheric effects, even the locals' reluctance to talk about the area. They were all signs that this place was wrong, dangerous, not meant for human habitation. But understanding didn't help us escape. The creatures were closing in now, their true forms becoming more visible as they abandoned their human disguises. They moved like liquid shadow, flowing around obstacles rather than walking through them. Their eyes reflected the firelight with an inner luminescence that suggested intelligence, but an intelligence so alien that communication was impossible. "There has to be a way out," Dylan said, still brandishing his knife, though we'd seen how useless it was against these things. "We came in somehow. There has to be a way to leave." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The forest had changed around us, rearranging itself according to rules we didn't understand. The very geography was fluid here, subject to forces that had nothing to do with natural law. The Brandon thing was speaking again, its voice layered with harmonics that resonated in my bones. "You can't leave because you're already part of this place. The moment you entered the hollow, you became connected to it. The change has already begun." And maybe it had. I could feel something stirring in my mind, a presence that wasn't entirely my own. My thoughts felt fuzzy, disconnected, as if they were being filtered through someone else's consciousness. The faces of my friends, Jake with his camera, Dylan with his knife, even the Brandon thing, seemed less familiar, as if they were strangers wearing the faces of people I'd once known. Jake suddenly cried out, dropping his camera and clutching his head. "Something's in my mind," he gasped. "I can feel it. Changing things. Rearranging." Dylan tried to reach him, but the creatures flowed between them, separating us with walls of living shadow. I could see Jake through the darkness, but he was changing, his movements becoming fluid and unnatural. The transformation was visible, his human form stretching and distorting like a reflection in warped glass. His face remained Jake's face, but the proportions shifted subtly. Eyes too bright, smile too wide, features that were almost but not quite human. "It's beautiful," Jake said, his voice taking on that same flat, emotionless tone we'd heard from the Brandon thing. "I can see everything now, understand everything. You should stop fighting it, Mike. Stop fighting and join us." Dylan backed toward me, knife extended uselessly in front of him. "They're taking us one by one," he whispered, "converting us into whatever they are." I could feel the presence in my mind growing stronger, pushing against my consciousness like water against a cracking dam. Images flashed through my thoughts, memories that weren't mine, experiences of hunting through dark forests and changing human flesh into something more useful. But underneath the alien intrusion, I felt something else. Anger. Pure, clean rage at what these things had done to my friends, at how they'd violated our minds and bodies. The anger was human, completely human, and it gave me something to hold on to as the transformation tried to take hold. "Dylan," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "The fire. They don't like the fire." He followed my gaze to the campfire, which had somehow maintained its blue-green flames despite the lack of fuel. The creatures stayed well clear of the light, flowing around it but never getting close enough to be illuminated by the strange glow. "Fire's not much use if we can't take it with us," Dylan replied, but he was already moving toward the woodpile, gathering branches that could serve as torches. The creatures sensed our plan and moved to stop us. The Jake thing reached for Dylan with those impossibly long fingers, but Dylan swung his torch in a wide arc, forcing it back. The flames left trailing after images in the air, and where they passed, the creature's form flickered and wavered. "They're not completely solid," Dylan observed. "The fire disrupts whatever they're made of." I grabbed my own torch and joined him by the fire. The Brandon and Jake things circled us like wolves, staying just beyond the reach of our flames. But there were other creatures now, emerging from the forest in greater numbers. Tall, gaunt figures with faces that shifted and changed like smoke. Things that might once have been human, but had been transformed beyond recognition. "How many people have they taken?" I wondered aloud. Dylan's face was grim in the firelight. "Probably everyone who's ever wandered into this place and didn't make it back out." The creatures were massing for an attack, flowing together into a single dark mass that surrounded the fire ring. They moved with perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single intelligence. And maybe they were. Maybe whatever force had created this place was using them as extensions of its will. "On my count," Dylan said, hefting his torch like a weapon. "We make a break for where the trail used to be. Maybe if we can get beyond the clearing, the forest will revert to its normal configuration." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only option we had. The alternative was to stand by the fire until our fuel ran out, then be taken one by one like Jake and Brandon. "Ready?" Dylan asked. I nodded, gripping my torch until my knuckles were white. 3, 2, 1, go. We ran towards the edge of the clearing, swinging our torches in wide arcs to keep the creatures at bay. They flowed away from the flames like liquid shadow, but they reformed immediately behind us, cutting off any retreat. The forest ahead was still impossibly dense, trees packed so tightly together that we could barely see gaps between the trunks. But as we approached with our torches, the trees began to shift and move, creating narrow passages where none had existed before. "It's working," Dylan shouted, forcing his way between two massive oaks that had parted just enough to allow human passage. We pushed deeper into the forest, following what might have been the ghost of the old logging road. The trees continued to move around us, sometimes opening passages, sometimes closing them again. It was like navigating a living maze, one that changed its configuration with every step. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, the sound of things moving through the forest following our trail, not footsteps, but something else, like wind through leaves or water flowing over stones. The creatures were coming, and our torches wouldn't burn forever. "There," Dylan pointed ahead to where the trees opened into what looked like the original trail. "I can see the creek crossing." We ran toward the opening, our torches streaming fire behind us like comets. The pursuit was getting closer. I could feel the presence of the creatures pressing against my mind, trying to slow us down, make us turn back. But the anger was still there, burning clean and human in my thoughts. I held onto it like a lifeline, using it to push back against the alien intrusion. We burst through the tree line onto what was definitely the old logging road, marked by the familiar pattern of rotting stumps and straight-line tree spacing. The forest was still moving around us, but more slowly now, as if the further we got from the hollow, the less control the creatures had over the environment. "Don't stop," Dylan panted, though his torch was beginning to gutter out. "Keep moving until we reach the main trail." We jogged through the darkness, guided by the faint starlight that managed to penetrate the canopy. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded, though I couldn't tell if the creatures had given up or if they were simply moving more quietly. It wasn't until we reached the Sipsey River Trail, marked by the familiar red blazes on the trees, that we finally allowed ourselves to stop and catch our breath. "Are they still following us?" I asked, looking back toward the way we'd come. Dylan listened for a moment, head tilted. "I don't think so. Maybe they can't leave the hollow. Maybe that's where they're bound." We made our way back to the trailhead parking lot in the dark, stumbling over roots and rocks but driven by the desperate need to reach civilization. My car was still there, covered in dew but otherwise undisturbed. The sight of that familiar blue Honda filled me with more relief than I'd ever felt about anything in my life. We drove to the nearest town, Double Springs, and found an all-night diner where we could sit under fluorescent lights and try to process what had happened to us. The waitress looked at us strangely. Two grown men, dirty and exhausted, clutching coffee cups like they were lifelines. "You boys okay?" she asked. "Look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Dylan replied. "We never reported what happened to the authorities. Who would believe us?" Two friends went missing in the wilderness, and we came back with a story about shape-shifting creatures in forests that rearranged themselves. They'd assume we'd suffered some kind of psychological break, or that we'd killed Jake and Brandon ourselves and made up the story to cover our tracks. Instead, we agreed to tell anyone who asked that our friends had decided to extend their camping trip, that they'd wanted to explore more of the backcountry and we'd hiked out early. Eventually, when they failed to return, we'd report them missing and let the search and rescue teams draw their own conclusions. But I know the truth. Jake and Brandon are still out there, still in that hollow, transformed into something that wears their faces but isn't them anymore. Part of whatever ancient presence inhabits that place, luring other travelers into the woods to join them in their eternal hunt. Sometimes I wonder if we really escaped at all, or if we're still sitting by that fire, slowly being changed into something inhuman. The memories feel real, but then so did everything else that happened in that place. I haven't been camping since, haven't even been hiking on established trails. The outdoors, which once felt like a source of peace and renewal, now seems full of hidden dangers. Every shadow could conceal watching eyes, every sound could herald the approach of something wearing a human face. Dylan moved to California 6 months after we returned, claiming he needed a change of scenery. We exchange emails occasionally, careful messages that never mention what happened in Bee Branch Hollow, but I can read between the lines. He's as haunted by the experience as I am, as uncertain about what was real and what might have been some shared delusion brought on by isolation and fear. The only physical evidence we have is Jake's camera, which somehow ended up in my backpack during our flight from the hollow. The memory card was corrupted, showing only static and fragments of images too distorted to interpret. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can make out familiar faces in the digital noise. Jake and Brandon, looking back at me from whatever hell they've been transformed into. I keep the camera in a drawer, wrapped in cloth, afraid to look at it but unable to throw it away. It's proof that we didn't imagine everything, that something terrible really happened in that place. But it's also a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to share, too alien for human minds to fully comprehend. The locals in Double Springs still warn people away from the deep backcountry around Dismal's Canyon. They speak in vague terms about folks who go missing, about strange sounds in the night, about places where the forest itself seems wrong. They probably don't know the specifics of what lurks in Bee Branch Hollow, but they understand that some places are better left unexplored. I should have listened to them. We all should have listened. But it's too late for regrets now. Too late for Jake and Brandon, certainly. And maybe too late for Dylan and me as well. Because sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I feel that presence stirring in my mind again. Feel the boundaries of my humanity growing thin. And I wonder if the transformation was really stopped by our escape, or if it's simply taking longer than expected to complete itself. If one day I'll wake up with reflecting eyes and too many teeth, ready to return to the hollow and help lure the next group of travelers into the darkness. The thought terrifies me. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, it also fills me with an anticipation I can't quite explain. And that terrifies me most of all.